This video is a complete summary of all canon subject matter towards the series in question. It contains spoilers and details for numerous aspects to the story and its events, and is not meant to serve as a replacement to experiencing any of the pieces of media mentioned. Please support the official releases of the developers and their entries in the franchise.
That the book would not be destroyed as I had planned. It continued falling into that starry expanse of which I had only a fleeting glimpse. I've tried to speculate where it might have landed, but I must admit that such conjecture is futile. Still, questions about whose hands might one day hold my Myst book are unsettling to me. I know my apprehensions might never be allayed, and so I close, realizing that perhaps the ending has not yet been written.
In 1993, Cyan Worlds released Myst for Mac OS, with a Windows port soon to follow. It was an unexpected success for the company, due in part to its revolutionary graphics, accessible gameplay, and immersive world-building. The audience that the original game reached was something not yet seen in the youthful gaming industry, especially in the personal computer corner of the market. Through this success, Myst spawned a franchise, and was the best-selling PC game and series until nearly a decade later when it was passed by The Sims. The Myst series was known for leaving the player to connect the dots, and piece together not just how to complete an objective, but sometimes what that objective was to begin with. Cyan made it clear that even with sparse initial info, there was much to uncover. Second only to its mind-numbing puzzles, Myst prided itself most on its worlds. The original developers even rebranded themselves to emphasize this. The player can easily go from knowing nothing about their surroundings to becoming acquainted with its history, people, flora, and fauna in just a few hours. And of course, linking these worlds, characters, and events together is a story, one that connects the series and spans thousands of years with the full lore only available to those who look through everything. While the Myst lifespan wasn't the longest, it was robust. Over the roughly dozen years of the franchise's active development, 5 core games in the series were released: Myst, Riven, Exile, Revelation, and End of Ages. Additionally, there was a spin-off game titled Uru with subsequent expansions. Following Uru, a short-lived MMO named Myst Online Uru Live was released, which has maintained subtle relevancy through community efforts, and it filled in some blanks in the franchise lore. Finally, the canon included a book series consisting of the Book of Atrus, the Book of Tiana, and the Book of Dunny. All these pieces together form the structure of Myst's timeline, along with some other details made through announcements or comments of the game's staff to give added clarity. To help with the consistency and excessive information, I'll keep a note in the bottom with current year, the relation and time to the games, and the source of said information. Without further introduction then, let's begin the complete history of the universe of Myst. This story recounts the rise and fall of a family, a civilization, and quite a few ages. The first events ever recorded in the series are from nearly 10,000 years ago. The Dunny are the most famous and prominent race of non-humans in the Myst chronology. However, the story actually begins with a people known as the Ronei. Ronei practiced an ability known as registoi, or often simply called the art. This art was a mastery of the ability to write powerful books of various different worlds that they imagined. A master of the art could write in immaculate detail and elegance their vision of a world in all of its inhabitants, history, locales, as well as other flora and fauna. Upon completion, these writers would be able to physically travel to the incredible world that they had described. These worlds would become known as ages. To the Rone, ages were believed to have stemmed from a multiverse, visualized as a great tree of possibilities, all of which were created by the Maker, also called Yavo. As was orthodox to the religion, most believed that ages were already created and existed somewhere in the infinite multiverse, and that writers were simply creating a link to them via the art. However, some misguided individuals, who we will see later, believe that as writers of an age, they created that world out of thin air. By writing an age, they breathed life into a previously empty void, and were now their god. The other set of logistics of the art to keep in mind are the two types of books that were written by these masters. These were descriptive books and linking books. A descriptive book is the greater, larger, and more detailed version of an age. This is what the writer spends the bulk of their time on when creating an age. With the book completed, a link would be established to one of the infinite ages of the Great Tree. Afterward, a linking panel would appear on the first page of the book. When touched, a user could link to the age described in the linking book. No two descriptive books could link to the same age, and no descriptive book could be duplicated. Even if the two were written with the same text, they will link to two very similar but still different ages. Thus, they are crucial for a link and are normally kept safe after writing, as if they are damaged, the link is broken. They are always written in a special dialect, Garo Hefti, believed to be the only language known to handle complex descriptions in a finite space. While writing a book meant finding a new branch of the infinite tree, it was observed that alterations can be made. Even when a link was established, there were probabilities in the age not set in stone by the book's description. Thus, in a way, additions and alterations could be made to a descriptive book without damaging a link, so long as it didn't contradict anything already written. This required extreme skill and attention to detail, as it could lead to risks in damaging or completely severing the link to an age. This can all be compared to a linking book. A linking book can be seen as a smaller, more portable version of a descriptive book. A linking book is written with the intention of being a reference to a descriptive book. Contained in the linking book are common combinations of paragraphs and descriptions that point to the original descriptive book. However, through pointing to an existing descriptive book, a linking counterpart would obtain its own linking panel on the front page, like a descriptive book. This made linking books much more practical for use in linking, along with the fact that a descriptive book can have multiple linking books pointing to it. Often, a descriptive book would be locked away unless it needed to be referenced or altered, while linking books would be used to, well, link to it. If they were damaged or destroyed, nothing would happen to the age they linked to, and travelers often carried linking books to their age of origin to link back whenever. Some without exceptional knowledge of the art needed additional power channeled to a linking book for them to function with only references, as we will see later. Some limitations do exist, however. A curious trait was that they needed to be written in the age they were linking to, and where they are finished is where the user will link, compared to a descriptive book where a writer could specify the linking point. However, a linking book could be written while the descriptive book is in another age, so long as the writer has extensive knowledge of it. A linking book could not be used to link from one part of an age to another, as linking implies, and thus requires, dimensional transfer. A linking book could actually be written in any language, so long as it referred to specific dunny passages. A linking book is determined by its descriptive book. If a descriptive book is altered majorly, especially if this caused its link to shift to a closely resembling age, chances are the linking book would be rendered useless, as it now points to nothing. This is why alterations to the descriptive book must be made with a careful and skilled hand. Finally, and most importantly, neither descriptive nor linking books travel with you when you use them to link, but everything else on the traveler's person will. The Dunny language was actually known as the Rone language because of the name of the original people. The Rhône were a society of writers with guilds that revolved around the creation and upkeep of their incredible books. They resided in the age of Garternay and held a deep belief in Yavo the Maker and creator of the great tree of infinite possibilities. Rhône were very similar appearance-wise to humans, with only slight differences in aspects such as facial structure. There was one obvious difference, however, and that was their lifespan. Often Rhône would live well over 300 years old on their home age of Garternay. As with many stories, life seemed peaceful for this world, but tremendous power like the art often leads to tremendous complications. The story begins properly with the life of a gifted Rhône writer. The young Rhinaref was born on Garternay nearly 10,000 years ago, on a planet that was flourishing with masters of the art. He was able to join the Guild of Writers at the age of 5 and was quickly recognized for his talent and brilliance as a writer. He quickly grasped the intricacies of the art and produced incredible results by the time he became a guild master at the young age of 90. Guild masters were the second highest rank in guild hierarchy, second only to the guild's elder, the Grand Master. The current Grand Master would quickly come to odds with Rhinaref, much to the latter's discomfort. While the current Grand Master remains nameless, their impact on Rhinaref was absolute. When Rhinaref was about 135 years old, his superior, the Grand Master, asked him to write a descriptive book to a new age, one that would cause Rhinaref to question the teachings given to him, as well as his superiors. Rhinaref was asked to create an expansive age that contained a simple, uncivilized race which would be eventually used by the Rhône. While specifics are not present, the reasoning is likely exploitive, likely a means of creating a subservient serfdom or even slavery world. Much debate was brought about because of this, mainly between Rhinaref and his master. Eventually, he refused the task and resigned from the guild. This was unprecedented and a bit nerve-wracking to the people, as what was basically the greatest writer among the Rhône was no longer a part of the official guild, though this controversy was nothing compared to the turmoil to come amongst the Rhône. Being the scholar he was, Rhinaref not only created ages, but studied existing ones as well. He would frequent himself to Garternay's descriptive book and its inner workings. This, combined with his talent for the art, allowed Rhinaref to see a bleak future for the age. He could see that Garternay was nearing its end. More specifically, Garternay's sun was dying, and thus Garternay itself would soon become cold and uninhabitable. It took a couple years to confirm his suspicions, but when Rhinaref was about 150, this information was made public and preparations were made. Garternay would likely become uninhabitable in only about 60 years' time, and a new world was needed. Fortunately, creating worlds is not something the people of Rhône are inexperienced in. The Guild of Writers banded to spend the next 6 decades creating a suitable replacement home world for the Rhône, a world that would later be known as Terra Ni. Rhinaref, however, who had grown to distrust the general philosophy and teachings of the Rhône, had other plans. Rhinaref took on a young apprentice named Eilish, and together they spent Garternay's remaining lifetime writing an age of their own. Large, vast, and secluded, the book was finally ready in time for the grand exodus of the Rhône. While the king of Rhône actively encouraged all of his people to follow him and the bulk of the populace to Terra Ni, he allowed small factions to go off into ages of their choosing. Over the past decades, Rhinaref had convinced a few thousand Rhône citizens who were loyal and respected the wise writer to go with him and his apprentice to their new age. The age was dubbed Dunny, meaning a new beginning, but to the existing natives it eventually grew to have another name: Earth. The exact time frame for this exodus was often brought into question, but after accessing more sources, the date of 7656 BCE was found to be equivalent to the year of Rhone Exodus and the founding of Dunny. This faction of Rhone would grow to call themselves Dunny, to recognize their separation and pride of their new home. While Dunny was vast and beautiful, Rhinoref led the exodus of his people to the caverns below the surface, as he thought surviving in harsher conditions would prove more favorably with their god, Yavo. These conditions were far from unbearable, and the Dunny flourished under Rhinoref, who was quickly crowned the first king of Dunny. His accomplishments included creating a new temple of Yavo for the Dunny people, improving the ventilation of fresh air in the caverns, allowing for an extended societal stay. The guilds during the Era of Kings were many, and included the 18 guilds of Garternay. These would become the only guilds in the post-King era, but for now there were dozens fit for various tasks and roles in Dunny, with new ones popping up throughout its history. Rhinoref was extremely devoted to Yavo and his teachings. He thought that the guilds were created in service of Yavo, not the people, and this philosophy lasted through the future monarchs of Dunny society. Rhinoref bore no children, and so passed the title of king upon his death to the first Grand Master of Dunny's Guild of Writers and his former apprentice, Eilish. An enormous portion of the history of Dunny can be told through the succession of its monarchy, though often periods of rule can be either brief or without much information recorded. For the sake of brevity, we'll not linger longer than we need to, but the majority of this portion of our journey will be spent going through the 34 kings of Dunny. Eilish, like his predecessor, was popular. He further helped develop the Dunny people into a group they could be proud of, taking the good from their Rhone heritage and adding what they perceived to be the righteous path of their people. Eilish's most notable accomplishment was the construction of a common library in Dunny, allowing for any citizen of any stature to have public access to the various ages written. Unlike Rhinoref, however, Eilish bore children, though it was not until he raised his third son, Shomat, before he decided that he had found someone that shared his philosophy and was a worthy successor. At the age of 350, Eilish passed away, allowing for the first Dunny-born king to ascend the throne. Shomat was the next in line to the throne of Dunny. He was also a skilled member of the Guild of Writers before taking the throne. His brothers, whose throne was denied, actively tried to cause instability within the court. This, amongst other corrupt thoughts within King Shomat, caused controversy. He ordered the building of an extravagant royal palace, which became much more luxurious than anything else in the caverns. He also believed that ages and their inhabitants were written to serve Dunny, rather than the other way around. He started becoming more and more ruthless. He had a garden age written for his personal use, and when natives of said age planned to revolt, he had it rewritten to become uninhabitable to said race. In response to his jealous brother's plan to overthrow Shomat, he tricked them all into entering a death book, a form of linking book that when entered, the traveler would be immediately killed by the environment. This included many possibilities. This was of course reacted to strongly by the people of Dunny, and thus a prophet was assigned to the king to give them guidance in the righteous philosophy of Yavo. She performed admirably, and as a result, Shomat became more respectable in his rule. This set the tradition of the king choosing a prophet or prophetess to guide the king during their tenure. Because of his deeds, Shomat decided it was best for his family line to end and pass the throne to the son of a close friend. This newly crowned king was Jakreen. The first non-writer king, Jakreen was a guild master in the Guild of Stonemasons, another of the 18 major guilds. These guilds were modeled after those in Garternay, but had more limitations, as well as monitoring was put in place to avoid the corruption that was prevalent originally. Jakreen made the most of his architecture expertise. He led construction of both the King's Arch and the Temple of the Great King. Tragedy struck this king, however. His son fell ill to a fatal disease that claimed his life at only 10 years old, while his wife passed away around 10 years after that. Chakrin took his mind off things by building a starting settlement of what would be Dunny's main capital city, built on the coast of the Dunny Lake, a city later known as Agura. While Chakrin would eventually remarry and have a son and 2 daughters, he died saddened as the weight of loss from his first marriage carried with him to his grave. Chakrin's son, Visha, would ascend to the throne. Visha's reign was uneventful for the most part, but it's noted that he was extremely religious as opposed to his father, who rejected religion after tragedies befell him. Visha would incorporate stricter laws regarding things such as marriage and adultery. Some were pushed away by these stricter personal conventions that were being forced on the populace from Visha's rule. Visha had a total of 5 sons. However, his youngest, Mararin, was almost killed and fell into a coma while exploring an age. Healers advised Visha that his son would never reawaken. Despite opposition from doctors in the church, Visha proclaimed to Dunny that Yavo would heal his son. Despite the odds, Visha kept his faith, and 3 years later, his son was revived. Visha would pass on the throne to this youngest son, believing him to be a symbol of rebirth, which had swayed the populace's opinions on the faith. Mararin was a member of the Guild of Maintainers before his coma. He was less strict and withdrew many of the imposing rules set in place by his father. He worked hard to establish institutions such as minor guilds, which would aid the education of Dunny. He was also quite the hedonist, engaging in frivolity as well as recreational drinking and drugs. While not a stern leader, he was well-liked, and that's about it, honestly, with Mararin's rule. He would pass on the throne to his son, Karim. Karim was a guild captain in the Guild of Linguistics, who specialized in language and communication with peoples native to other ages. Still, even hundreds of years later, Karim's grandfather Visha had a lingering impact on Dunny. Many sects and groups arose opposing Visha's strict teachings and certain rules that were still in place, and numerous individuals thought they had the right to exercise Yavo's judgment on anyone lesser to them. The largest and most dangerous of these were known as the Judges of Yavo. They had secretly written an age known as Pento, with natives that the judges thought could be easily manipulated into a warrior race that would fight for them. Unfortunately, they were correct. The judges amassed their army and attacked the Dunny Palace. With his wife soon to give birth, King Karim ordered his family to evacuate. His family were able to warp to a private royal age that Karim had made for just such an occasion. For the next 30 years, the Pento War raged in Dunny. Karim himself stayed in the city, leading the city guard and militia against the judges and the Pento, but it was not enough. At the age of 243, Karim was assassinated by Pento warriors, throwing the city into chaos. Legend says that Alcendar was born under the King's Arch, while his family was escaping the palace to a secret linking book to a hidden age. While he remained hidden during the Pento War, his uncle, along with some advisors, kept him and his family informed of the events in Dunny. This included the death of his father when Alcendar was 29. His uncle advised the newly crowned king to wait and strategize instead of immediately returning to Dunny. Alcendar was wise and heeded the advice of his uncle. In the weeks that passed, the judges who had seized control of Dunny grew concerned that the leader of the Pento was becoming too powerful and uncontrollable, and so they had him killed. This caused civil war within the Pento in terms of deciding a proper heir, and spread them thinly throughout the city. Hearing news of this from his uncle, Alcendar made his move. He assembled a small force and returned to Dunny, quickly gaining additional followers. He quickly reclaimed the palace and established safe zones. He allied with one of the princes of Pento, Mekar, and offered to write his tribe a new age if they would help fight against the judges and quell the other factions of the Pento. Alcendar was good on his word, writing an age for the Pento and sending leaders of the judges to prison ages with no linking books and thus no means of escape, where they spent the remainder of their lives. During his proper rule, Alcendar kept his focus on returning to the principles established by Rhinareth, the first king, to forget the homeland and focus on why they were in Dunny. Alcendar opted to not have an official advisor, and merely kept a prophet as a figurehead. Secretly, he worked with writers and healers on a plague that could be used as a weapon in case of emergency. Unfortunately, this weapon would be needed sooner rather than later. When Makar, the former Pento ally to Dunny, came through a linking book given to him by the judge and commanded a siege of Dunny, the war was not yet over. Makar was successful in killing Alcendar's wife and 2 sons, until eventually the Great King killed Makar himself. Just 2 days later, in an act of vengeance, he ordered the plague to be released into the new Pento age. In just 3 days, the entire population of Pento was killed. Not just them, though. Some Pento with other books from judges linked to other ages and infected other cultures. The plague was engineered such that the Dunny would be immune, but various chemists feared that it had the potential to mutate into something that could harm its makers. Books to Pento were found and burned, but guilt weighed on the king's shoulders. 35 years later, Alcendar revealed to the public that he released the plague to Pento and asked to be locked away in the temple of the Great King for his wrongdoings. He left the son of the Grand Master of the Guild of Writers, Sorath, a will that would give instructions on how to open the temple, which asked would be read only after 6 months had passed. They obliged, and Sorath would become temporary king. However, after the time had passed, the will was read aloud to Dunny, and it revealed that there was no way to break the seal, and Sorath would be crowned the new, permanent king. Some thought to break it by force, but were vehemently opposed to breaking a direct order from the king. The Temple of the Great King was renamed to the Tomb of the Great King, as Alcendar was presumed dead. Though some held out hope for the eventual return of the Great King, Alcendar's legacy would be mixed and thought differently for centuries, but no one truly knows the eventual fate of the King of the Pento War. Solath was in such genuine shock that his rule would become permanent that virtually no one questioned his knowledge of the will's contents. By comparison, Solath's rule was uneventful. However, there was some religious upheaval due to Alcendar's actions. A famous book, the Book of Nemea, was written which denounced the Great King and gained some supporters. Solath tried to maintain unification, which included spending resources to build new districts for frivolity and the arts, which did excite people, and culture remained stable. He received some controversy after remarrying following the death of his first wife, and even more when a son born of his new wife would become the new heir to the throne, a son named Maerta. Maerta's reign was much more turbulent than his predecessor. He proposed some unorthodox teachings that were the first to go actively against the beliefs of Rhinareth. He was likely manipulated by his mother, Jolatha, who was a member of the cult known as the Tree, which believed the books buried with Alcendar held great power. Against the advice of most of Dunny, Maerta built a Temple of the Great Tree, along with temples for other cults that others could use to worship. Eventually, these became more prevalent than the Temple of Yavo, and eventually, this temple became devoid of worshippers. Maerta attempted to change rules and make reformations for standards that had been in place since the second King Eilish. These were met with firm opposition from people such as Tremal, a Grand Master of Writers. Angered, Jolatha ordered him to be killed. This backfired for the Queen and caused him to be seen as a martyr against the king's propositions. Following the beliefs of the Tree, Jolatha convinced the king to force open the seal of the Great King Alcendar. Books were taken, along with certain items claimed to be on the person of the Great King, and they were moved to the Temple of the Tree. However, this would be fate's final straw for the manipulative mother of the king. Jolatha died just 2 days later of unknown causes. Mayerta was extremely fearful of this, believing it to be a curse for breaking the seal, and in response, closed the tomb of the Great King once again, and created a new seal, making it even stronger than before. However, as it would soon become known, the damage had already been done. Mayerta's final years were spent with his wife until he was poisoned at the age of 267. It was unknown who could have done the deed, but Mayerta's enemies were high and the suspects were many, one of which was his eldest son Gan, who Mayerta ironically left as the primary heir to the throne. Gan despised his father's lack of a backbone, especially in making decisions for himself. While not extremely religious towards Yavo, he did condemn the actions taken by his father and grandmother. However, he didn't have much time to take action, as the cause of Jolatha's sudden death came to light. The books removed from the tomb of the Great King were discovered to hold a mutated version of the plague cast upon the Pento, and as a result, an epidemic grew in Dunny. Most actually blamed this illness on the Great King, as he decided to cast a plague on the Pento in the first place. Gan was likely a victim of Alcendar's plague, and served the shortest reign of any king, 55 years, and yet was still fortunate enough to have a son. Ben-Asheron was the youngest king of Dunny to ascend the throne at the age of 20. The young king lacked strong leadership or consistency. He would often spend his time making speeches, offering prayers to whoever would listen. This might be Yavo, the tree, or any other cult of Dunny. All during this time, healers and chemists were struggling to find a cure for Alcendar's plague. Infertility rates were high, and Ben-Asheron could not find an heir before his death, and thus passed on the throne to his uncle, Hemelin. Hemelin was a member of the Guild of Healers, and was extremely dissatisfied that public opinion of the guild was poor. Hard to blame them, as a cure was looking more and more unattainable by the year. However, King Hemelin held out hope. He believed that a cure existed in one of the ages of the books of old from the initial arrival of the Dunny, specifically the Book of Bereni. However, these books have been lost almost since the arrival of the Dunny. Hemelin was commanding, though, and had greater power shown than his nephew tenfold. However, he became ill and bedridden for years, with doctors claiming it would be fatal. There he met a healer named Leyland, who would care for him during his illness until he miraculously recovered. Hemelin insisted that his recovery was thanks to his motivation to keep living one more day so he could see his lover Leyland once more. Leyland's deeds to Dunny would not end here, as through her research she eventually uncovered the Book of Bereni, where flora was discovered that could be mixed into a drink used to help the body combat the plague. In 6 years' time, the plague was declared eradicated, and the lovers wed. As a symbolic gesture, Hemelin did not pass on the throne to his offspring, but to Nagin, the first child born in a post-plague Dunny. Nagin was responsible for development into major fields, the advancements of the fine arts, and the continuation of his predecessor's further development at the Guild of Miners. Both these expansions, in culture and in the physical tunnels, became known as the start of the Dunny Renaissance. Nagin led the development of a new council building to be built on the Tomb of the Great King, which served as a symbol of hope and rebirth. He also encouraged the public to save their wealth for future generations in a shared treasury, guarded by a set of puzzles, which would become heavily ingrained in Dunny tradition. After his achievements, Nagin would leave the throne in the hands of his third son, Hinash. Hinash was a member of the Guild of Stonemasons, and as a result was deeply interested in continuing the expansion of the Dunny cave system. He would happily continue the development of advancements being made by the Guild of Miners. Hinash also pushed for better relations with other cultures, Soon, the transfer of goods and culture between ages was growing more accepted and prevalent. People were emigrating to Dunny more and more. Hinash would have 4 children with his first wife, but when she died, he remarried to a non-Dunny outsider, which was unheard of at the time. Unfortunately, he bore no children with his second wife, and so he left the throne to the youngest child of his first wife, Nidra. Nidra was known for continuing the king's effort to increase expansion within the caverns. However, it was his mission to increase the motivation of the Dunny public towards expansion. He was able to push these agendas through his exceptional speeches and charisma, along with the sculpting and carving talents of his good friend Lakir. Together, along with Nidra's brother, they set out creating 4 new districts within Dunny, expanding it greatly. Nidra had no sons of his own, so he left the throne to the oldest of his brothers, Rakeri. At this point, the Dunny civilization had lasted for 3,000 years, and for the first time, enormous dissent was weighed in on the current king. An intelligent prophet, Tevar, was a devoted follower of the great king and Yavo. He believed that the Dunny Renaissance was a period of religious confusion amongst the people, and focus needed to be returned. Tevar was charismatic and motivational, and often would overshadow the presence of the king himself, even losing a formal one-on-one debate. However, Rakeri had the humility to accept Tevar's skills, and asked to make him his main prophet. After Rakeri's ignorance, he asked his people for forgiveness from him and his predecessor's deviations from Renaref's teachings. Thus began a period of renovation of the poor areas of Dunny, and the unification of separated classes. Rakeri and Tevar died a year apart, and the crown was given to Rakeri's son, Tehara. Tehara was, quite frankly, one of the most selfish and deceitful kings of Dunny. He would order extravagant ages written at the cost of writers. He would have multiple mistresses, and would kill many people he found to be impeding his own happiness, including the Grand Master of the Guild of Miners. However, he was a master of manipulation and secrecy. Most of these deeds were never found out until much later. Tehara was mostly indifferent to the populace, and considering most were still satisfied following the motives left by Tevar and Rakeri, Tehara was considered a decent king at the time. Tehara left the throne upon his death to his third son, Tiamel. Tiamel was also fairly self-centered, but was less severe, but also was less skilled at hiding it. He would spend most of his time bathing in self-luxuries. However, his wife was a strong leader and showed a high example of strong beliefs and purposes. One of the most notable events was when a colossal digging machine named the Stone Eater was christened. Tiamel took most of the credit, much to the dismay of Naman, the Grand Master of the Guild of Miners. But regardless, expansion of the cave systems continued. Tiamel would leave the throne to his son, Kedri. Contrary to his father, Kedri was an immensely popular king. Most agreed that this was because of the massive influence his mother placed on him. Kedri was a man of the people, leading a number of proposals that would benefit the lower classes, including the creation of a residential district filled with affordable housing. He walked through the streets and attended events with the populace. Because of all this, he is often cited as the most popular king in the history of Dunny, and was loved until he passed away at the age of 329, passing the crown on to his son, Lemashal. Lemashal fancied himself as a sort of illusionist. He practically forced the establishment of the Minor Guild of Magicians. He also established the Relima, a sort of secretive intelligence group to keep track of potentially dangerous factions in Dunny. Lemashal was also known for his influence on outsider cultures, trying to establish freer trade with them and more peaceful dealings. He also remarried to an outsider after his first wife passed away. There was debate as to whether a half-outsider would be allowed to take the throne. To curb public unrest, Lemashal signed into law the council's movement of a king needing to be of pure Dunny blood. Lemashal thus left the throne to a son of his cousin, Ishek. Ishek was a mix of Kedri and Lemashal, the two men who came before him. Like Kedri, he focused on the people and preferred to view himself on even footing with them. And like Lemashal, he also gave a focus towards improving non-Dunny cultures and helping them expand. The main event during Ishek's rule was when his wife was kidnapped by a group of natives from the Age of Yamas. They used Dunny linking books to escape and made impossible demands of the Dunny people in return for Ishek's wife. It was actually discovered that the Yamasans were being paid by a faction of isolationist Dunny who wanted to sow the seeds of distrust with other cultures. Ishek and the Relima uncovered the plot, and Ishek's wife was recovered. Controversy with how relations with other tribes should follow were still lingering, however, and they would continue into the reign of Ishek's son, Loshmanesh. Loshmanesh was supportive of mingling with other cultures, but was also one to put more strict regulations into place. These would become his Loshmanesh laws, which seemed to be established as a result of the incident that befell his mother. They essentially stated that the crime of creating or trading illicit ages, or coercing outsiders to commit crimes, would be sentenced to life imprisonment on a prison age. There was adamant protest from some of the populace, who thought that Dunny should be sealed off for good. The group started to become a majority. This was until Loshmanesh became a martyr for his cause, when he was assassinated by the same group that led the kidnapping of his mother. He was succeeded by his nephew, G. G lacked much of a backbone during his reign and didn't hold much of an opinion. He sided with whoever was making a convincing argument with him at the time. During this time, a prophet dubbed the Watcher rose to prominence, and he spoke of a reading of the future that saw a great destruction of Dunny, which would take place. One of the Watcher's great prophecies was of a family that all fit various roles and tales to change the Dunny: the rebuilder of pride, the burdened one, the writer of dreams, the grower, and the sons of the burdened one. The grower was the one with the most power, leaning towards the supernatural, in fact. Though these prophecies lingered in the writings of the Dunny, they would not come to fruition for millennia. G himself was the first king to have a divorce, two in fact. Most of G's reign was one of inaction, and because of the lack of firm leadership, Dunny became divided, and the people felt they lacked guidance considering how much power they wielded as writers. G would eventually leave the throne to the son of a close friend, Demath. Most of the public weren't happy with G's reign, but they were both surprised and pleased with the decision to shift power to one outside of the family. There was an immediate order on enforcing a ban on links that weren't deemed necessary to Dunny. Relations with outsiders started to become more restricted. He even went on to denounce the Watcher, and certain groups began associating with outsiders more discreetly. More people started joining major guilds, but they would also become more expensive to afford. Crime was overall cut down during the reign of Demath as well. The Relima was expanded, and eventually the leader of a dangerous cult known as the Blood of Yavo was found and imprisoned. In terms of technological advancement, the stonemasons developed an early fusion compounding technology, which would eventually lead to the development of the hardened crystal commonly used by the Dunny, called Nara. Eventually, Demath passed away, and left the reign to his firstborn son, Yeblishan. Yeblishan held similar beliefs to his father, and was less of a strong leader. The Blood of Yavo eventually kidnapped Yeblishan's son, and asked for the release of Goshen, the leader that Demath had imprisoned earlier. The Relima were asked to find the son, but it was discovered the Secret Service had a mole in the ranks, and was a member of the Blood of Yavo, so progress was halted. Yeblishan gave in to the demands and released Goshen, only for him to discover his own son dead on the steps of the palace a few days later. Isolationists were a minority of the Dunny populace, but they were slowly gaining popularity. The society became very split. In an effort to shift attention from this divide, Yeblishan ordered a restructuring of the major guilds, which reduced restrictions on their self-development, a change received well by the guilds. An explosion on the age of Myaenas brought strength to the isolationists, as Yeblishan put more resources into finding the stopgap of information in the ranks of the Relima. Yeblishan passed without any children, and left the throne to the husband of his younger sister, a man named Emin. A member of the Guild of Illusionists, Farish, appointed by Yeblishan to look into the Relima's corruption, discovered two moles during Emin's reign. They were quickly taken care of by the Dunny Council, and Faresh became a silent hero as a result. Later, a cult known as One Dunny was found to be the perpetrators of the explosion on Mianus, and were imprisoned. 2 new food ages were established as well, Shimas and Hirias, with a variety of fruits and vegetables non-native to Dunny. The popularity of these ages helped improve non-isolationist sentiment with the natives of Shimas and Hirias. Some public-owned islands in Dunny became privatized as well. The public ferry system was also improved from the main Dunny City Island to other surrounding ones. Emin set aside one of these islands to become a cultural center, and gave it to be shared between the guilds of artists, musicians, and actors. Emin passed away popularly, and gave the throne to his firstborn son, Maemin. The first event during his reign was unfortunately another plague outbreak. This one occurred in the district of Noerl, and as a result most became frightened and started to evacuate Agura. Maemin summoned guild and grandmasters of the Guild of Healers to the palace, but was disappointed by their lackadaisical stance and lack of motivation. Meanwhile, a guild captain named Iram seemed motivated, and Maemin gave him the resources to eventually develop a cure. Maemin as a result formally appointed Iram to the Grand Master of Healers, while expelling the former master. With new digging technologies, a new industrial section, Uran, was created. Maemin was more shifted towards technological advancements than religion during his reign. Eventually, his son Asham fell extremely ill and passed away, resulting in Maemin renaming Uran to Ashamem and falling deeply depressed. Most decisions went through Maemin's prophet, Trisari. Maemin would later appoint his nephew Adesh to be his successor. Adesh would also seek advice from Trisari, and would be more religious than his uncle. A new prophet, Gish, appeared, similar to Tavar, but Gish only praised Yavo and criticized Tavar and the Great King. Gish became extremely popular, despite Adesh's constant arrests and denouncements of him. Eventually, in a fit of rage and frustration, Adesh ordered the Relima to kill Gish. This action was met with heavy criticism from the populace. Gish became a martyr, and eventually resulted in the assassination of Adesh. According to rumors, by one of his own advisors. His firstborn son, Lenarin, succeeded him. Lenarin denounced his father's actions, and started to make plans to disband the Relema. He also announced that he promised to eliminate outsider involvement. Ages requiring outsider involvement were slowly beginning to be phased out for ones without native peoples. Lenarin pushed forward with a plan brought up by Maemin, which was to build a tunnel from the island of Dunny to the city, and planned for more expansion of residential and cultural districts, one in particular, the Lenarin district of laborers. The tunnel was cancelled due to resistance from the island residences, who liked their isolation, with travel limited by boat. Lenarin passed away, but not before the Relima were officially disbanded in Dunny. He was succeeded by his youngest son, Asemlef. During Asemlef's rule, he continued the technological advancements of construction and expansion, while also encouraging philosophical discussion. Factions worshipping the Watcher, Gish and Tavar all began to form, and Asemlef welcomed intermingling and discussion of their beliefs. There were common rumors of Asemlef using servants for extremely cruel purposes, however, including hunting them for sport, or staging them in gladiatorial-style battles. Whatever the case, it seemed to be mostly in secret. Regardless, assemblies focused on expansion, construction, and offering benefits to all classes, except royal servants, apparently. He would pass the throne to his youngest son, Jaron. Similar to his father, Jaron continued to support construction and renovation amongst all classes. Most violent factions were at the time dissolving, and he was able to focus efforts on the progression of the city without many consequences. Some say the greatest expansion in all of Dunny was during the reign of Jaron. Jaron saw the introduction of both the Rockbiter and Burrower, while overseeing the completion of the Rudena Passage, the widest new tunnel ever built in Dunny. He would pass on the throne to his third son, and penultimate king, Rikuth. Rikuth had uncommonly unenvious siblings, who would go on to be extremely caring and reliable advisors. This family would prove to lay the foundation for the shift to a council in years to come. Expansion continued, and Rikuth would marry a supporter of Gish and the fallacy of the Great King, Hisha. Rikuth would begin to lean towards the intermingling of outsiders more, claiming their influence of Dunny's history and culture shouldn't be understated. In the years that followed, however, he became tired of Hisha and her views. He expelled her from the palace, along with one of their sons, Karath, who was most influenced by her. Near the end of his reign, Dunny was enormous, but people were divided in their classes and in their religious opinions. As the legend goes, Rikuth chose one of his older sons to be a successor, but on his deathbed, he could see his son Karath sailing through the King's Arch on a boat with a proud lizard on its prow. In that moment, Rikuth felt the hand of Yavo, telling him to make Karath the next king of Dunny. Karath was extremely influenced by his mother, and thus Gish and Yavo, but also from seeing the relationship his father had with his advisors. Karath would craft his arguments detailing how the certain ways his people had been ruled for the last thousands of years have been wrong. He decreed that power should be in the hands of the guilds, as the Dunny have always been as strong as the guilds and their protection. Most of the population were losing the loyalty of the kings and supported this proposal. He ordered construction of a new guild hall, and the tomb of the great king became further buried under massive buildings, which were built for government and guilds. By the end of his reign, Dunny was isolationist and convinced of the beliefs of Karath and Gish. He abdicated the throne to 5 lords, which became the Dunny Council. The number of major guilds was reduced to 18, the original 18, inspired by Gartenay. The time of kings was over. Karath became the most famous king moving forward and came to represent all kings. The Arch of Kings was renamed the Arch of Karath, and his coronation was commemorated as a holiday. For the next 1,000 years, the council led the people of Dunny towards continued structure and expansion of the caverns. It was a relatively uneventful time for the Dunny, but considering the history and the time of kings, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The people became content during this time of relative ease and peace. It had been about 8,000 years since Rainref had arrived. Time began to be spent once again towards creating lavish ages. The garden craze of the 8100s began, with many of what would be dubbed rest ages becoming popular. Ages such as Edergira and Ederkemo were written and open to the public. A force of maintainers became established, which was a security force amongst Dunny, used to maintain order, with a sense of less strictness compared to the Relima. They were based on the age of Gari Sen. The Age of Teledan was written by the current Master of Writers, Mararan, as a present for the Master of the Guild of Caterers, Hinash. It is filled with edible mushrooms and spores, some of Hinash's favorites for ingredients. Later, they were mined for resources that nearly destroyed the entire age. In the 9300s, human timeline 1600s, a gifted writer is born to 2 Dunny named Kalis and Tessera, a boy named Atrus. For about 10 years, exploration begins to shift upward, and the council asks for an attempt to be made to dig a tunnel to the surface. This leads to the creation of the Great Shaft, a vertical tunnel which will aid in the construction of a means of getting to the surface. However, after the deaths of 2 workers and the near death of a friend of Atrus's, Veovis, the project ended. However, the link to the surface wouldn't end there. In fact, this was just the push needed to ultimately allow 2 worlds to meet. But in order to construct a true passage, some help needs to be made on the other side of the tunnel, from the human-owned surface world. Anna was a thinker and a master of approaching problems from any angle. She was born to a geologist, and together, Anna and her father made a decent living in their work. When Anna was 18 years old, her father was employed by Lord Amanjira of Tajinar, in the present-day region of New Mexico. They were employed to scout the region for precious minerals. During their expeditions, they discover a curious rock formation, a stone circle, and the 2 contemplate what could have caused it. Unfortunately, Anna's father becomes ill and cannot report back to Amanjira. Despite protests from Anna, her father insists on leaving him behind to rest near the dig site while Anna delivers the report to their employer. When she returns to the dig site, Anna discovers her father has been exploring the area around the stone circle. He is excited to share with his daughter the discovery of a rock wall that appears to be blocking some kind of tunnel, a deep one. Over the next 10 days, the two finally manage to break far enough in to start traversing the tunnel. Both explorers have their imagination sparked as to what could lie beyond. Deeper in the tunnel, Anna not only finds water, but a reddish substance that her father theorizes may be artificial. Anna's father could only begin to deduce what this could mean when his illness caught up with him. He was suppressing it for the sake of the expedition, but Anna awoke the following morning to see that her father had made his way into the cavern one last time, only for his daughter to discover him after succumbing to his illness. Meanwhile in Dunny, there is a renewed appeal to continue the expansion to the surface, but the final ruling will be decided in a council vote. Both Atrus and Veovis are now members of the council. Veovis has become increasingly xenophobic, insisting the only creatures on the surface are savages, and he tries to sway Atrus, along with other council members Fihar and Swarnir. While the latter two appear convinced, Atrus isn't, and decides to abstain from the vote entirely. Anna is left at a crossroads at the dig site. She was still grieving her father, but was alone in the arid landscape. Thus, she made preparations to head back to Tajinar. However, to satisfy her curiosity and in honor of her father, Anna decides to head back into the cavern one last time. She goes deeper than they had ever attempted together with her father. What she found was beyond anything she anticipated. Going deeper and deeper during her excavation, she discovers more evidence that this tunnel was artificial, and even discovers some tools and digging machines. Eventually, it became clear that she was on the outer reaches of a civilization, one that wasn't deceased. Her assertions are proved true, as almost out of nowhere her curiosity takes her to the Dunny city itself, as she sees the Dunny civilization around a deep underground lake. Anna stood dumbfounded, and she couldn't believe what was before her eyes, but before she had time to appreciate it, she was arrested by the local Dunny patrols. Simultaneously, the vote to tunnel to the surface is about to begin, as Atrus starts to have doubts. He feels so strongly that exploration should continue, that he feels he should not abstain. Voting is postponed for an hour for more discussion to take place, as a messenger bursts into the guild house, interrupting deliberation to relay urgent events. Shortly after, the council announces to Dunny that further digging isn't necessary, as a surface dweller has just reached Dunny. Anna is immediately imprisoned and interrogated by Dunny, and we're at a loss for what exactly to make of her. Over time, she proved her intelligence by acquiring enough of the Dunny language to be able to present herself before the council. Veovis and certain members disagree with allowing this outsider to speak with the council, but Atrus and others cause a change of heart with the current lord of the council. Upon intensive questioning, she is released, but she was not allowed to return to the surface, as while the council trusted her for the most part, humanity as a whole was still deemed too hostile. Atrus is asked to let Anna live with him, where Atrus quickly agrees and offers to teach her more about their culture. Here, Anna learns about the magic of the art, where she is instantly blown away when Atrus takes her to their family age of Koa using a linking book. Later on, Veovis starts to warm up to Anna. Veovis, Anna, and Atrus become close friends and connect over time, with the three often spending time on Veovis' island home, Kavir. However, Veovis and Atrus disagree on one crucial issue, whether or not to teach Anna the art. Soon though, Atrus makes the decision himself, and he and Anna begin writing the Age of Gemedet together, named after a Dunny game that the two would play together often. Veovis reported this to the council, who revoked Atrus' linking books. However, after convincing the guildmaster Kedri that this was merely a sign of progress, and throughout Dunny records it was not unheard of to teach outsiders the art or language, it was ruled that this should be allowed for the betterment of Dunny, and the books were returned. Gemedet is created, and Anna and Atrus bond while exploring their age. After some time, Anna learned the art completely and was able to link anywhere she chose, including back to the surface. However, she decided to stay, as she and Atrus had fallen in love. Eventually, she was proposed to by Atrus, and the two were wed following a full blessing from Atrus' father. It was around this time that Anna began to return the favor to Atrus' teachings by giving him stories of the surface. Over the course of their relationship, Atrus starts referring to Anna by the nickname Tiana, which means storyteller. She grew fond of the name and would become addressed as such by the Dunny from here on. They are happily wed for the next few years and would go on to have a son named Gen. Agarus was a member of the Guild of Writers and had been gathering a good reputation for himself until he was accused of a number of crimes against Dunny, most notably of which was the stealing of a precious linking book. Though he denied the charges, he was still expelled from the guild and had his betrothal broken. He decided to move to the lower city, where he established a name for himself as the Philosopher, writing pamphlets for the residences of the Carathan district, but in reality he set his sights on dismantling Dunny. He was enraged for his expulsion and punishment and wanted revenge by destroying Dunny. After his reputation had grown, he had a meeting with Veovis where Agarus learned of his bitterness towards the growing approach to Dunny cultural expansion with outsiders and wanted that hate to grow. To do this, Agarus would frame him. Agarus was a master forager and would write documents to implicate Veovis of trading illegal linking books. He would also kill 2 young maintainers using a dagger belonging to Veovis. All this would lead to an investigation that resulted in Veovis being sentenced to a prison age for life, where he would seemingly never know who implicated him. Tiana and Atrus' son Gen is appointed to the Guild of Bookmakers, and Atrus convinces Tiana to finally take them to the surface. They made a temporary base of operation at a spot named the Cleft, which was a small gash in the ground near a dormant volcano. This was located directly above the Great Shaft in what is likely modern-day New Mexico. After they returned to Dunny, Agarus made his move. He was able to get access to Veovis' prison book and free the framed writer. He was easily convinced to aid Agarus in his plan to tear apart Dunny. The two of them, along with their friend Swarnir, plotted various terrorist attacks on Dunny. This included planting a bomb in the Dunny Inkworks and desecrating one of the 5 classics, the masterworks of Dunny. Agarus was able to do this by replicating the original writer's handwriting and altering passages that tore the world apart. Tiana, fearing the safety of her son, rushed to be with Gen. Their son was already a special case among the populace. He was the first half-human, half-Dunny child, and as a result of his biology, he suffered many ailments while he was a toddler. He was also harassed amongst his peers, but got through his training due to his sharp mind and intelligence. Along the way to check on her son, however, Tiana discovers Veovis, along with an unrecognizable age, later known as Ederot. She links to the age, where she quickly recognizes both Agarus and Swarnir, who are later joined by Veovis. Through her investigation, she discovers documents and journals linking Agarus to the framing of Veovis. She also is able to overhear the 3 taking responsibility for the acts of terrorism and their bigger plans to collapse Dunny. During Tiana's investigation, Atrus starts having suspicions of his own and asks Veovis' prison to be investigated by the council. His judgment proves sound as the prisoner is nowhere to be found within the age. A search is begun for the escaped. Meanwhile, Atrus discovers Tiana to be missing without a trace. While he searches, Veovis appears before Atrus and tells him he has Tiana hostage, goading him into following Veovis to Ederot. Veovis is unaware that Tiana is actually in Ederot. Veovis and Agarus quickly knock out Atrus and imprison him as bait for Tiana. Tiana, already in that age, gathers some evidence, along with a few linking books Veovis has to leave Ederot. She eventually discovers an imprisoned Atrus, but not before being discovered herself by the 3 terrorists. Tiana flees, partly through setting Veovis' linking books ablaze, except one that leads to the chambers of the Dunny Council. Tiana links, and without knowing the destination, Veovis does as well. The 2 link and appear before the council, where Veovis is immediately sentenced to be executed, after Tiana's evidence implicates him for the attacks. However, after further investigation of the evidence, it was proven that Agarus framed Veovis for the earlier crimes of smuggling and murder. Tiana pleaded with the council to reduce the sentence, and they obliged. Instead of execution, Veovis would once again be sent to a prison age. However, this time, the only linking book to the age would be destroyed upon his entering. A rescue party is sent to Edorat to retrieve Atrus. Agarus, who suspects this will happen, hides while the search party comes and lets them discover Atrus and Swarnir. Knowing they will bring a linking book back to Dunny, he secretly links back without the party knowing, and overhears the trial of Veovis and his sentence. Before Veovis can be sentenced, Agarus infiltrates the council and locates his prison book. He enters the prison, linking book in hand, and awaits the sentenced prisoner. Atrus returns to Dunny, and along with his wife, they stay with their son Gen until his graduation from the Guild of Bookmakers at age 8, about 2 to 3 years later. Meanwhile, Veovis is tossed into his prison age, stripped of all belongings, and the linking book burned. However, an acquaintance was waiting for him. Veovis was at an impasse. He now knew Agarus was likely the one to frame him and start this messy chapter of his life, but at the same time, their ideals were still aligned, and Agarus had his only means of escaping this lifetime of imprisonment. Eventually, he decided to take Agarus' offer to escape, and the two fled back to Dunny and went into hiding, developing their new plan. For the next 2 to 3 years, they forced chemists to work for them in secret, developing a biological weapon that had the potential to bring the Dunny civilization immediately to an endgame. By the time Gen's graduation had arrived, Tiana felt he was becoming more distant from her. Gen loved his father, though. He was beginning to feel more and more ashamed of his human heritage and did not want to be seen as an outsider. However, while these thoughts were racing in the family's mind, during their son's graduation, a loud explosion from the walls of the Dunny cavern could be heard. From the walls began to pour a dark cloud, which soon reached Dunny and its inhabitants. The gas was deadly and spread quickly through the streets of Dunny, infecting nearly all who came into contact with it. Nearly all of Dunny was devastated, with only as few as several hundred being able to escape to other ages. Almost instantly, a civilization nearly 9,500 years old was destroyed in what became known as the Fall of Dunny. Tiana, Atrus, Gen, and Atrus' mother Tessera were able to escape the Fall of Dunny by quickly linking to one of Atrus and Tiana's own ages, their first one, Gemedet. Atrus spends the next few days crafting equipment, mainly a simple gas mask that he can use to return to investigate Dunny. Reluctantly, Tiana allows him to go. It's a grim sight in Dunny. The entire civilization is ruined, deserted, and he finds the council dead. He deduces they were killed by a virus that was dispersed by the gas attack. Unfortunately, it doesn't take long before Atrus becomes heavily fatigued and nauseous, and realizes that he has the disease as well. He spends the energy he has left mapping out an escape route through the tunnels of Dunny, while finding a good hiding spot for his Gemedet linking book for when he warps back. Eventually he does, and quite literally collapses back to Gemedet, where he rests in the care of his family for several days. Unfortunately for Atrus, while his symptoms pass, being away from the main gas, he does pass the disease to his mother, who succumbs to the disease on Gemedet. The rest of the family realizes they are stranded on this age, and their only option is to try and mount an escape through Dunny. After a few days of preparation, they make their way to Dunny, where Atrus provides them with his map of the tunnel system. At some point, Atrus hears cries of help coming from within the city. Ever the selfless, Atrus gives Tiana and Gen his map and begs them to continue to the surface. Not taking no for an answer, Atrus bids his family farewell once more. He didn't mention it, but Atrus recognized the scream. It belonged to his old friend Veovis. He arrived to find Veovis bleeding out from a wound to his back. With his dying breaths, Veovis explained that he had been betrayed and stabbed by Aegarus, and that he was likely to kidnap Atrus' family now that they were separated. Aegarus had wanted to turn their age Edorat into one where they would be worshipped as gods, something Veovis was vehemently against as it went opposed to all beliefs of Dunny. There's an upside, though. Aegarus has no linking books and would likely not head back to Dunny or to the surface. He would likely go to an outer library of linking books. Veovis' old home, Kavir. Veovis gives Atrus a linking book to Veovis' study, which contains a book specifically to Kavir so he can cut Aegarus off, as Veovis finally succumbs to his wounds. Veovis was correct in his assertions. Aegarus had kidnapped Tiana and her son and was using them as hostages, but when he arrived in Kavir, he did not expect to find Atrus waiting for him. Atrus revealed that he had burned the library's contents and all its linking books, much to the anger of Aegarus. He threatened to hurt Tiana, but as soon as he turned hostile, Atrus pulled out a book on his person. He used it to link, beckoning Aegarus to follow. Realizing Atrus must have other books on him to leave said age, Aegarus gave chase and warped without a second thought. But even then, though, it was too late. The book the two had linked was Aegarus' Age of Edorat, but heavily altered by Atrus. He quickly rewrote the age to destabilize its structure and cause the world to erupt into a blazing inferno. This was not a prison age, it was a death age, and both Atrus and Aegarus' fates were sealed the moment they touched the book. Tiana could read the Edorat book and understood what Atrus had done. She and her son mourned the sacrifice of their beloved Atrus, but eventually they knew they had to escape. Using Atrus' plans, notes, and maps that Tiana still had, she was able to backtrack and eventually made her way back through to the surface, where she and Gen arrived at the cleft, where they were finally free from the caverns. Tiana would remain at the cleft, farming and caring for her son. However, Gen only grew to resent his mother more and more for what befell his father and his people. Gen would continue to only grow prouder of his Dunny heritage and denounce his mother's human half. Eventually, 6 years after arriving on the surface, when Gen is 14, he runs away from the cleft. Tiana attempts to find her son, but eventually concedes that she won't be able to find him on her own, and continues to farm, garden, and care for her small oasis, alone in the cleft. Gen wanders about the barren areas of what is currently the US and Mexico border. He wandered for days until he was eventually found and taken in by a people known as the Ahmad. It was clear to Gen that these people weren't Dunny, as they had no knowledge of the caverns besides legends of their people. However, they also possessed certain Dunny technology, such as a basic imager, sort of an early form of holograms. Upon further study decades later, it became more likely that these people were the result of old tales of a Dunny becoming lost in the caverns and making their way to the surface eventually. There they intermingled with local Native American tribes. Given the time period and location, this was likely either the Suma or Mescalero Apache tribes. Here, these people seemed to belong to both humanity and Dunny, not unlike Gen himself. And so he stayed, embracing the culture and even falling in love. He would eventually marry an Ahmad woman named Leira, also known as Keita. When Gen was just 19, his wife became pregnant with their child. Even scarier, however, she fell ill, and no one in the tribe could do much to aid her. Desperate, Gen swallowed his pride and attempted to seek his mother for assistance. They found their way back to the cleft, where Tiana still resided. It had been 10 years since Gen left, but despite this, his mother was willing to help. But even her assistance was limited. She was able to deliver the child, but despite her best efforts, she could not save Keita, who died in childbirth. Gen was furious, once again denouncing his heritage and claiming his disgust for his mother. He carelessly dug a grave for his fallen wife in the garden of the cleft that Tiana cared for. An angered Tiana insisted to give her grandson back to his father, but Gen claimed, "You saved it, you look after it," and he fled once more. This time Gen went underground, and went into the now ruined Dunny city, where the air was finally becoming survivable. There he tried to piece together what he could about his ancestors and progenitors. Meanwhile, Tiana, now in her early 60s, was left in charge of her grandson, whom she named after her beloved husband, but simplified by removing the I. And thus, Tiana would raise the young Atrus in the cleft. Anna would raise Atrus alone, as a hermit within the cleft. She would only have occasional contact with some caravan traders that passed from time to time. She was self-sustaining, though. Not only could she farm, but she was able to carve from rare minerals and create paintings, all of which she would trade for other forms of food, as well as things like textiles. She was very protective of Atrus. She would teach him the Dunny language, as well as stories of the civilization, but was fearful of outsiders with her grandson. She would teach him to hide on the opposite side of the cleft's volcano while the traders were nearby. Atrus was a smart boy, running various science experiments in the cleft, but he was also kind as he tried to follow the teachings of Tiana. He loved his grandmother, but Atrus longed to see the world and explore instead of staying in the cleft. Meanwhile, underground, Gen was foraging what he could from a lost society. He would piece together an incomplete education of the art through ancient tattered books he found in the ruins of Dunny. During the following years, he would practice by writing ages only to dominate, conquer, and eventually destroy them. He believed in the writer as the creator of ages, and thought he had the right to rule over any age he had written. However, these ages were flawed. Gen wasn't a master of the art, far from it. His knowledge and teaching was incomplete, and this often left his writing with contradictions and fragments that led them to quickly decay and collapse soon after the completion of their descriptive books. Finally, on his 5th attempt, Gen was able to create a stable age that lasted well enough beyond the completion of a descriptive book. This one was made by piecing together fragments of pre-existing books. This is actually not an uncommon technique, but it's used in order to create linking books from a descriptive one. Linking books are often created from specific fragment placement from the original descriptive book. However, creating an entirely new descriptive book from combining others was something that had not been seen. Gen would dub this semi-successful 5th attempt the 5th Age, and would soon begin exploiting it for his own means. In actuality, the natives referred to their own home as Riven, and the people there, the Rivenese. Out of respect for the Rivenese, everyone besides Gen referred to the age as such, as will we as we continue. After 14 years of conquering and ruling over Riven, Gen decided it was time to start teaching an heir. The only woman he ever loved was Keita, and thus his only children would ever be the one he left with his mother. He decided to return to the cleft to retrieve his son. He forced Atrus, now a teenager, away from his grandmother and led him to the ancient Dunny cities. There on the island of Kavir, where his grandfather perished, Atrus was taught the ways of the art by his own father. Atrus was clearly gifted, embracing what Gen knew quickly, while also intuitively picking up on what his father lacked. In a few years' time, Atrus far surpassed his father in skill. During these lessons, Atrus witnessed how on his father's ages, Gen was revered as not just a king, but a god, convincing the people of his abilities as a creator and a wielder of the art, something Gen wholeheartedly believed himself. Upon the years of training he was with Atrus for, his son witnessed Gen conquer and destroy ages, both societally with his tyranny, and structurally with his poor grasp of the art. Gen believed he was a god as the one with the most Dunny blood left, who still had connections to the capital itself. It didn't take long for the observant Atrus to realize that his father had gone mad, and even after repeated attempts to sway his father's mind, it seemed to have been lost to power. After arguments over the ethics of being seen as a creator to an age, and an attempt to escape to the surface was thwarted, Gen locked Atrus away in a room on Kavir, where his only means of escape was the Riven descriptive book kept locked in the same room. From this point onward, Gen would start to shift most of his focus towards Riven as well, and look to the natives to begin teaching the ways of the art. Fortunately for Atrus, his grandmother hadn't stood idle while her beloved grandson was taken. Tiana followed Gen to Dunny, Kavir, and later Riven, watching over her grandson from the shadows. Not long after arriving in Riven, Atrus was taken in by the locals and met a native Rivenese girl named Katrin. Catherine's name would eventually be altered to Catherine later on due to Atrus's initial mispronunciation, though Catherine quickly grew fond of it as a personal nickname. Catherine was one of 10 other Rivenese who Genn was training to build his own guild of writers. She quickly stood as the one most capable with the art. Noticing this, when she was in her 20s, Genn betrothed her to himself in order to help him restore Dunny and rule over more ages that she could help him create. Genn believes that Catherine would be easier to control than his son, who he deems as impossible to manipulate at this point. Of course, this was all in the hopes of Genn. No students other than Atrus had actually shown tangible results with the art. This was until Catherine put her dreams to paper. Catherine attempts to use her knowledge of the art to write the abstractions of her dreams. In her writing of a descriptive book, she tries to put her ideas to paper, bending a lot of rules that seem conventional for the art. Eventually, a panel started to take shape in the book, and Catherine herself was able to travel to this strange, fantastical place. She needed to show someone whom she could trust, and so went to Atrus. Atrus read Catherine's book, and while he admitted the world was beautiful to read, it was full of contradictions and broke most of the rules of writing with its physics and wildlife. However, after some persuasion, Catherine was able to convince Atrus to link to Catherine's first age. There, he saw a wondrous sight, an age with 2 flat sides and a tunnel in the center connecting either side, with a contained water cycle through the tunnel, causing perpetual fog and an upward water cascade. Here the rock was glassy, but had the texture of wood and smelled of roses and camphor. The air had a smell of lemon, pine, and cinnamon. There were no natives, but it was full of butterflies on the lighter side and golden red fireflies on the darker side, along with these shifting, fluid, dreamlike creatures. Atrus was stunned by the talent and skill on display from Catherine. He wanted to know more and encouraged the two could learn from each other, and thus they grew close. It became increasingly clear that not only was Genn growing insane, but desperate. His skill in the art was not as refined as Atrus's, or as imaginative as Catherine's. He needed them if he was not only to rule over subsequent ages, but also to keep the current one alive. Riven was Genn's best age to be sure, but that didn't mean it was stable. Some signs were already starting to show a long-term deterioration of the age, and it would likely only survive a few more years on its own. Eventually, it was decided by Catherine and Atrus to escape Riven. They decided to write a new age with a single linking book for them to escape to, while at the same time removing all means of Genn being able to escape this age. At this time, Tiana had met up with Catherine to help her with the new linking book, though she would only reveal herself to Atrus after the book was complete. While Atrus kept Genn busy with his research, Tiana and Catherine would work on the age. Eventually, this age became known as Myst. Myst was a small but quaint age, and over time, it was fleshed out with devices, living quarters, and eventually some linking books that Atrus brought to the library on Myst Island. During this time as well, Catherine also worked with Tiana on the Riven descriptive book. They worked to try and repair the instabilities that had existed since its creation. While it likely multiplied the lifespan of Riven, it left a few anomalies. Various enormous daggers appeared in the landscape as a means of representation of the pins and stitches the world needed to survive. Amongst the most notable anomalies was the opening of a small gash in the ground near one of Riven's temples. Atrus and Catherine discovered this phenomena and saw that it led to what could only be described as a vast starry expanse, as if looking into the night sky itself. However, it was not entirely like outer space. It wasn't a vacuum, it appeared like there was air inside, and puffs of smoke and swirling gaseous mists could be seen within the rift. The pair thought to use this in their escape, and decided to take the Riven descriptive book with them and make repairs remotely after trapping Genn. Genn was growing suspicious of his cohorts and decided to speed along wedding plans. Realizing it was now or never, Atrus, Catherine, and Tiana put their plans into motion as well. On the day of the wedding, similar to Atrus's grandfather, he snuck into Genn's laboratory and burned all of his linking books, and later regrouped with Tiana and Catherine. The two of them used the book on Atrus's person, a linking book to Myst, and the last linking book on Riven. After the two left Riven, Atrus fled to the Starfisher where he was met by Genn. They had a temporary standoff when Atrus made his play. He fell into the Star Fissure, linking book in hand, and while falling, warped to Myst. This left the Myst book to fall deeper and deeper into the Star Fissure. Hopefully, this book would be lost forever, leaving Gen without any means of linking out of Riven, and Atrus safe with the two people he cared for most by his side. On Myst Island, the three would live in peace and spend their time writing ages. 2 years after arriving, Atrus and Catherine were wed in a modest ceremony led by Tiana, and years later they had their first son, a half-Rivenese, 3/8 human, and 1/8 Dunny boy named Akinar. 2 years later, another son, Cirrus, was born on Myst Island. For the next decade, the family lived peacefully and happily, taking care of themselves and writing books. Atrus would write the ages of Stoneship and Everdunes, befriending the natives of each. Meanwhile, Catherine would write the spiritual age of Serenia, one of her proudest accomplishments. Unfortunately, it was around when the two sons were turning 10 that tragedy struck. While exploring one of Catherine's ages, an accident occurred. The accident unfortunately took Tiana's life and devastated the family. Details of the incident are unclear, including the age that it took place in. However, it is known that her body was recovered and taken back to Myst, where she was buried. A tombstone still exists on Myst Island bearing her name. The death of the beloved Tiana sent different shockwaves to her family members. Since the incident occurred on one of her ages, Catherine felt deep regret and became consumed by sorrow. She vowed to never write with the art again after this incident. Meanwhile, Atrus did the opposite. He tried to support his wife, whom he did not blame. However, he became obsessed and lost in his writing, which would consume him for years to come. All this affected the children as well. Their parents were too distracted by the death of Tiana to properly care for them. As such, Cirrus felt like he had been rejected, and Akinar became stir-crazy after having a hard time to process such emotions. In his obsession, Atrus would write 3 ages and explore them thoroughly: Osmoian, Channelwood, and Selentic. These would be the first ages he would take his sons to in order to show them the potential of the art. Catherine was hesitant, but allowed it as she understood what this meant to Atrus. About 3 years after the death of Tiana, Atrus's depression had waned and sought his sights further on his sons. He saw his sons as the future of Dunny, and decided to begin to teach them about the art through practicality. He wrote Jananin, Voltaic, Edana, and Amateraea, specifically with the purposes of educating the boys on the principles and concepts of ages. Following tests on these 4 ages, a 5th was written, Narayan. This one was specifically meant to educate on the systems of a balanced age benefited by an active civilization, and vice versa. Narayan contained a mostly thriving society, and Atrus wanted his sons to learn from them. He spent a couple months with a Narayan scholar named Saavedro, who agreed to educate the sons on the principles of interdependence. During their education, the 2 sons' personalities would develop. Cirrus was soft-spoken, but highly intelligent. He would often assist his father with engineering projects and other technical skills. Akinar, meanwhile, was showing signs of erratic emotion and instability. He would often show signs of violence and hostility to local fauna that would worry his parents. Over time, the two became angry that they were not being formally taught the art by Atrus, who was hesitant due to the immense power that ability held, and knew from his father what would happen if someone without proper guidance had even the slightest bit of control over the art. This frustration would lead to the brothers becoming more and more power-hungry over time. Soon, Atrus wrote an age simply known as Mechanical, which was home to a large floating rig on a vast ocean. The residents who lived there were being threatened and plundered by a group of pirates known as the Black Ships, led by the Ebony Cardinal. Eventually, Atrus was able to construct some simple defenses for the people, but Cirrus had other plans. In an act of rebellion, he convinced his brother to come with him on a small boat and leave Mechanical in search of the Black Ships. Eventually, they found the ships and were brought aboard. The two were almost killed by the captain, but upon learning of their skills in violence and ingenuity, as well as their knowledge of their sworn enemy Atrus, they were permitted to be members of their crew. Here the brothers learned of tyranny and conquering, looting the rigs scattered across the mechanical age, becoming as dark as the pirates of the Black Ships, but much more capable. They became greedy, power-hungry, and even filled with bloodlust. Eventually, this age could no longer satisfy them, but they knew exactly where they could extend their reach. They waited for the opportunity to escape the Black Ships, not without some plundering of the ship itself, and fled to the main port of Mechanical, where they were eventually found by Atrus and Catherine. While the brothers were severely scolded and punished, their parents were mostly just happy to have their sons back again. But these boys had changed, and sought more than what they had been given, and they realized they had the means to obtain it. While the two sons weren't given the means of writing ages, they did have access to their fathers. Fortunately for the boys, their father was preoccupied over the course of the coming years, in writing new ages and maintaining the Riven descriptive book so it remained intact for the native people, the latter of which was becoming a concern for him. Atrus' ultimate goal was to rebuild Dunny, but if Gen caught word of this, he would certainly do everything in his power to assert dominance over the reconstruction, and Atrus couldn't let Gen's ideals influence the next generation of Dunny. He needed to ensure Gen was trapped without escape. However, going to Riven himself was too risky, as he would need to take a returning linking book, so he decided to write an age where he could experiment. Atrus wrote a Tundra age that had an ample supply of crystals that, when charged with the right frequency, could project images from linking books. He would hope to use these crystals to create a device that could observe Riven without actually going there. He dubbed the age Rime. It was around this time that Atrus began to fear losing his work to those who would be tempted by his ages. He would write 2 prison ages, Spire and Haven, written with distinctive red and blue linking books, and warned his family to never use them. Meanwhile, Gen was busy on Riven. He thought about jumping into the Starfisher after the Myst linking book, but figured the uncertainty of the chasm was too risky. He was, for all intents and purposes, trapped on Riven, without an exit. However, he decided to make an attempt to write. While he kept his subjugation over the Rivenese people, he continued his book experiments, writing hundreds of failed ages. Eventually, he was able to craft a small age with a single building that he would start to migrate to personally, in the event that he could not find any other means of escaping Riven before its collapse. Gen, in his systematic way, bluntly called this age the 233rd Age, its meaning obvious. The work on Rime had kept their father busy, and as such the two brothers set their sights on the ages that they could manipulate. This mainly meant ages that had sentient natives that they could exploit, namely Channelwood and Mechanical. They inserted themselves as kings and ruthless tyrants over the people, and exploited them for their resources, laying waste until the population dwindled and most of their resources had run dry. Though this was only half of their lives, they of course had to keep up appearances with their parents. When not subjugating an age, Cirrus was helping his father with constructing Rime. When not torturing an innocent populace, Akinar was assisting Catherine with maintaining the island. This all came to a culmination when the sons returned to Narayan. At this point, the boys were in their late 20s. They were more knowledgeable, more cunning, and obviously more ruthless. Narayan was a very traditional age. They worshipped and sacrificed a great deal to their deity, the Great Tree. The boys arrived and promised to make their lives immensely easier. They relayed information of the art, saying their inconveniences and struggles were all because their creator, Atrus, had written the age to show the boys what an age should not be. And with their knowledge of writing and the art, which they of course did not have, they could make the lives of the Narayans exceptionally easier by changing the basic structure of the age, but only if the whole populace agreed upon this. The brothers knew this would never happen, and only wanted to sow chaos and confusion amongst the people. As expected, the Narayan Elder Council, along with much of the older population, did not want to abandon the traditions of the people, while the younger members encouraged change and progress to benefit the populace. The brothers would continue to breed malcontent among the younger people and would often incite violence. The brothers' plan for anarchy worked too well, and in the end, an entire civil war began raging. The great tree of Narayan became unattended, and as such, explosive spores that were normally supposed to be manually brought to branches burst into hot steam, raining down and destroying several villages. Amidst the chaos, the boys decided to salvage all the valuables they considered worthy to take back to their home. The wild card in the Narayan Civil War was Saavedro, the old mentor of the brothers. He was shocked to see the boys return, and even more shocked to see them speak out against the traditions. Saavedro feared an ensuing rebellion and wanted to defuse the situation by talking to the younger side. He was afraid of his wife and children being caught up in the violence. Alas, the brothers were too convincing, and the civil war raged on. As the fighting reached Saavedro's village, he told his family to hide and went to confront the brothers. He was able to catch them just as they were leaving with boxes filled with valuables. They had just used the linking book to Jananin, as Saavedro, without thinking, followed them to the age with the intention of begging the brothers to keep their promise. The brothers expected some stragglers, and as such, they lured Saavedro inside one of the large tusks on the age, and knocked the poor man out upon entering. They tied him up and beat him severely, all the while explaining they didn't intend to fix anything, and intended to salvage from any place they thought were too easy to deserve otherwise. They lit a bonfire in the tusk and linked away, leaving Saavedro to die in a hostile age, burning to death. At this point, Atrus had essentially finished work on the chamber in Rhyme. Using proper crystals and specific viewers, he could get a live feed of any age given its descriptive book. He was able to see Riven, and could see that his father was still trapped. At this point, however, the brothers decided to do their ultimate goal of conquest, to steal what they felt was rightfully theirs, their father's possessions. First, they needed to get their mother out of the picture. They decided the easiest way would be to trick her. Catherine was aware the progress on Rhyme was nearly complete, and was eager to finally be rid of Gen in all respects. The brothers used her excitement against her by lying and saying that Atrus had already gone to Riven and was waiting for Catherine to join him. She believed the brothers and used a linking book to Kavir, which was the only means to get back to Earth or Dunny, and from there she took a linking book to Riven. Awaiting her was a stationed guard of Gen's at Riven's entry point, who immediately captured her and took her to Gen. Now to get rid of their father. Atrus wouldn't go to Riven, even if he was told his wife was there, as at this point Riven was becoming more and more unstable. If his wife was there, he wanted her to be safe, and that meant writing and reinforcing the descriptive book from afar to keep Riven alive as long as possible. So, when Atrus noticed Catherine's disappearance, they instead told him she was waiting on Kavir, which was now a waypoint between Myst and Riven. He believed them at first, but not before his preparations were completed, and was about to leave before he saw his sons start to burn his library, likely believing he had already left. He needed to make sure the Riven book was safe and still proceeded to Kavir, but not before leaving a message to Catherine, who he now believed to be still on Myst, and his sons were lying. However, his sons had managed to sabotage Atrus's returning Myst book by ripping out a page. Upon Atrus's arrival to Kavir, he realized based on Catherine's absence and the altering of his Myst book that he had been completely deceived by his sons, and now he was trapped. Catherine had left a note, seemingly for her sons, as she assumed that Atrus was on Riven, and now Atrus had assumed that Catherine had been tricked as well, and was on Riven, likely captured by one of Gen's guard. Even worse, numerous cave-ins had occurred over the years, and Kavir became cut off from the rest of Dunny. Atrus was trapped, without any access to other ages, or even the rest of Dunny and Earth. Cirrus and Akinar had seemingly won. Atrus's library was theirs, including all of his linking books and journals. Atrus had hidden all of the descriptive books to the ages, but the brothers assumed the linking books would be the only ways anyone but Atrus could access them. So, in their greedy nature, they looked through the library, keeping only what they deemed valuable, and burned the rest. This left only 8 ages: Channelwood, Selentic, Mechanical, Stoneship, and Rhyme, along with Spire and Haven. They also kept the Kavir book locked away in a secret entry in the library. The two's first target was clear: those mysterious red and blue books that Father had warned about. Spire and Haven, when being read and through its imager, looked like paradises of wealth and comfort, and so the two compromised. Cirrus went to the red book, to Spire, and Akinar to the blue book, Haven. However, as soon as they linked, something was wrong. These were not the ages observed in the book. Spire was a barren, rocky obelisk, cold and dark with a sea of grey clouds surrounding it. Haven was a jungle island filled with dangerous creatures and no other sentient life. These books were prison ages, designed to trick greedy adventurers with misleading descriptions and false images. Atrus also wrote his prison books with 2 interesting functionalities. First, they were incomplete and missing pages. These were rigged so the book would only work once, and then wouldn't work again until the pages were re-added. Second, these ages had a fixed capacity of 1. When someone attempted to link to the age, if someone was present, the current resident would be immediately sent linking back to the linker's original age. These were works of art from a writer's standpoint, but to the brothers, they only felt anger and hate toward their father, who seemingly left an act of spite upon them. Worst of all, no matter how hard they looked, they could not find any linking books on the island. They were trapped, just as they had done to their family. Myst was abandoned, and the family was separated and trapped on their respective ages: Cirrus on Spire, Akinar on Haven, Atrus on Kavir, and finally Catherine on Riven. Atrus constantly tried to reinforce Riven's descriptive book through his writing, but he knew he couldn't hold on forever. Meanwhile, Catherine's stay on Riven was interesting. On Riven, while she was being led to Gen, some assailants tranquilized Catherine's captors, as well as Catherine herself. She awoke in the headquarters of a rebel group of Rivenese, called the Moiety. Fortunately, one of the rebels recognized her, and filled her in on the events in her home age. Catherine was told that her home was now unrecognizable. Riven, once a large, diverse island, was fragmented into 5 smaller islands, with most of the frightened populace residing on the largest, forest-like island. The islands were connected by bridges and small maglev trams. She was distraught when she finally learned Atrus was not indeed on Riven, and that she was in fact tricked. Catherine wanted to prove her bravery and her loyalty to the cause by venturing out with a couple rebel members. Together they went to the highest point of the main island, and she could see the sorry state of Riven. She also investigated the star Fissure once again. It had been sealed with rock and a small panel of glass, with a telescope to observe it. She instructed the Moiety to stay away from it, as she wondered what secrets the void held, and if Atrus's Myst book was still floating in the endless starry expanse. From there, she also met with numerous villagers whom they recognized as their goddess, Katrin, the only one of them who could truly create worlds from paper. She heard from the villagers that Gen was using technological means to power and maintain books to compensate for his lack of the art. She was also given a failed experiment linking book of Gen's. Gen had tossed it into a furnace after seeing it fail, but it was salvaged by the Moiety. Catherine was still immensely skilled in the art, and made her decision to end her vow of not writing in order to help her people. From the salvaged book, Catherine wrote a stable age, small and a bit desolate, but with immense potential that would be the Rivenese and theirs alone. She convinced the Moiety to break into one of Gen's book-powering domes to steal a Riven linking book. Gen had them made so he could come back when going to experimental ages. Catherine needed one to travel back from her new age. With the 2 books in hand, the Moiety began establishing themselves on this new age, dubbed Te, also sometimes known as the Moiety Age, or simply the Rebel Age. Soon, nearly all of the Moiety were moved to Te, but nearly all of the common residents of Riven were still in villages, fearing Gen's wrath. Catherine would eventually try to convince the general people to join them, as Riven as an age was dying, and they deserved to be free. However, in the process, she was captured by Gen's guard and imprisoned. Gen tried to interrogate her, with Catherine being stubborn and only talking in Rivenese. He gave up once he was convinced she didn't have a linking book on her. Catherine was fearful. She and Atrus knew Riven was running out of time, likely only about 6 months before the age would collapse, and neither could do anything but stall the inevitable from their position. There were no linking books that Atrus could access besides the Riven descriptive book, but he needed to stay and continue writing just to keep the age alive day after day. Catherine was imprisoned, without access to Tay with the Moiety, or the Myst linking book that was lost forever in the Star Fissure. Or was it? The Star Fissure is one of, if not the most mysterious anomaly in the Myst universe. As Atrus observed when he briefly fell in, it appeared similar to outer space. However, he felt wind and an active current pushing him within, as well as a presumably breathable environment. Its origin is truly unknown. Gen believed it a result of Atrus and Catherine altering Riven's age during their escape. Catherine believed it to be an act of the Maker to serve a greater purpose. It is likely that the Expanse is a representation of the space between ages, the space that is traversed whenever a link is taken with a book. Of course, linking is so fast that a traveler will have no idea what it's traversing, so this might be thought of as a sort of dark matter between the ages of this vast multiverse, as if the fissure was a tear, allowing access to the space in between. Normally, I would steer away from speculation, especially when it comes from my own personal opinions. But with something both as mysterious and integral as the Star Fissure, I'm going to try and fill in some gaps present. It was observed both by Gen and briefly by Atrus that there is a sort of current within the Expanse. Atrus even noted that for the brief period he fell into the fissure, he could feel a sort of flow pulling a certain way, like a river. I would like to propose that currents within the Expanse are formed as a result of a flowing force between two rifts that have opened between ages, almost like the Expanse, even in this most brute force of ways, encourages linking. It's unknown how, or if, a second fissure was created. If it was, it might have been written into Dunny by the Guild of Writers of old, foreseeing any accidental fissure creation in distant ages, and if someone were to fall through. While Dunny likely didn't know everything about the Expanse, they might have been aware of some of its properties. If someone was exploring an age and caused a star fissure and fell in, they needed a means of escape. Thus, another opening on Dunny might have been written in that would appear for any traveler lost in the Expanse, giving them an exit. But where on Dunny? Putting it underground in the cavern was too risky. It needed to be large, but it was observed that these could be prone to absorbing its surroundings. Seemingly, if written purposefully, they could be put anywhere, even midair. Thus, it was to be put a few feet above the surface of Earth, right above the civilization of Dunny. And so when Atrus fell into the fissure on Riven and warped away, his Myst book kept falling through the fissure toward a seemingly empty point until suddenly the fissure opened once more, allowing the book through. It fell to the ground, only a few hundred feet from Tiana's old home on the cleft in the middle of 1770s New Spain, present-day Eddy's County, New Mexico. Here the book lay undiscovered for over 30 years. While the explanation for this journey is, again, mostly speculative, the takeaway here is that the Myst book did make its way through the Star Fissure on Riven, through the Expanse, and to the surface of Earth. That much is clear. Eventually, after these decades had passed, the book was found by a stranger exploring the area around the cleft. There they found the book and returned to their campsite. The book had a single word on the cover: Myst. Flipping through the book, they read a summary of a fascinating island with unique buildings, devices, and other books. It kept them busy all night until the book was finished. The stranger was satisfied, but still curious about the first page of the book, which appeared as a black panel. However, after staring for only a few seconds, the blackness shifted to a sea, that appeared to be moving, which would eventually pan upward to see an island in the distance. That was it! Myst Island! It looked so real in this impossible panel, almost as if the stranger could just reach out and touch it. Suddenly, the stranger was warped to the docks of Myst Island with nothing but the clothes on their back. The stranger's identity has never been formally revealed by Cyan Worlds, or anyone else for that matter. Given the location of the book and the real-life time frame, it's possible that the stranger is of either Native American descent, like the Ahmad, or potentially of Spanish-Mexican descent. However, they have been shown to read and understand English, Atrus' first language taught to him by Tiana, and thus how he wrote his journals. While possible, this was an exceedingly rare trait amongst the aforementioned groups. A somewhat popular fan theory is that this was a traveler who was along for the Lewis and Clark expedition and became lost on the return trip, eventually wandering to what is today the southwestern US. While a bit outlandish, it does match up decently with the time frame. None of these theories really matter though, as at the end of the day, the stranger is, and was always intended to be, you, the player. The stranger is essentially the only aspect of the universe to which the developers don't go out of their way to provide an explanation. Instead, any traces of the stranger's identity is left purposefully ambiguous to serve as a nice self-insert. The character is a silent protagonist. Entries featuring the stranger are always first person, where no traits of the character can be seen, and the character is referred to with they-them pronouns, or with general descriptions such as the traveler, or simply my friend. For the sake of consistency, the character will continue to be referred to as the stranger from here on. Upon composing themselves, the stranger explores the island and its mysterious fixtures, all abandoned. Many appear to be blocked off by various codes and puzzles. Eventually, they stumble upon Atrus' message informing Catherine of the betrayal of at least one of their sons, along with the burning of the books in their library. He mentions that he's hidden a few of these linking books before leaving, along with small hints as to where to find them on the island. From there, the stranger decides to investigate the library, where they do confirm that most of the books have indeed been burned, though some of Atrus' journals still remained, giving insight as to his adventures on some of these ages. Also in the library, the stranger finds the red and blue books to Spire and Haven. Upon opening them, they found a linking panel, similar to the one on the Myst book. However, this one didn't give an image, it was all static and noise, until they noticed a red and blue page next to their respective books, and when placed inside these strange bound books, the page seemed to merge back with its companions, as if it was never removed. Suddenly, a figure appeared. In their respective ages, Cirrus and Akinar noticed the opening of the book and could barely mention anything through the static, but could convey a request. They asked the stranger to bring more red or blue pages hidden across Myst, or potentially on other ages. Without much of a lead, and needing more information, the stranger decided to search and eventually uncover the hiding places for the hidden ages of Atrus. These included Mechanical, Channelwood, Selentic, and Stone Ship. Here they found homes wrecked with no natives and could see traces of devastation from both brothers. It appeared that Atrus had hidden a red and blue page in each of the ages, which the stranger could find using hints in Atrus' journals along with their own ingenuity. Each time a page was returned to the red and blue books, the static would dissipate a bit more, and the brothers would give a bit more information. Essentially, each tried to blame the other brother for the misdeeds of other ages, including the destruction of the library, as well as the imprisonment of the other brother and their father. They both insisted on their own innocence, and that the righteous thing to do would be to free them. Eventually, the stranger was starting to catch on that both of these brothers were to blame, and that they really couldn't trust either of them. Unfortunately, they had no other options at the moment and decided to be cautious as they continued searching for pages. Finally, the two brothers were extremely clear in the panel, and they both said they needed only one more page to be able to leave. However, all accessible ages were searched, including Myst Island itself. What else could the stranger have missed? The brothers both realized, of course, the secret alcove in the library, hidden behind the fireplace. Atrus put numerous secret items in the alcove. It must be there. But wait, the brothers thought. They also remembered what they themselves had put in the hidden chamber. They both separately gave the stranger the access code to get behind the fireplace, asking to retrieve the last page. But if they find a book with a green cover, do not open it. They both made up a lie of it being another prison book created by the other brother. The stranger left, found the proper code, and uncovered the secret alcove, where they found both pages, along with what was likely the book the brothers spoke of. The stranger felt they couldn't choose a page. They both were so untrustworthy that they decided to pick the middle route. They opened the green book and saw a linking panel with images slowly forming. Eventually a man, writing in a large tome behind a desk in a cave, could be made out. Atrus noticed he was being watched and called out to the stranger, asking who they were, but immediately following up by telling them not to link through yet. Instead, Atrus asked the stranger to find a missing page to a Myst linking book, giving them a few places it might be. The stranger would find the page hidden in a switch near the dock that the stranger first arrived at. With the page in hand, Atrus asked the stranger to finally warp through the green book, where the stranger found himself in Kavir with Atrus. Upon handing over the page, Atrus was quickly able to repair his Myst linking book, freeing him and now the stranger as well from Kavir. Atrus immediately goes back to Myst and burns the linking books to Spire and Haven, keeping their descriptive books locked away. Upon return, he talks a bit with the stranger. The stranger talks about all that had occurred. Atrus laments that he cannot provide much of a reward for freeing him, besides free access to his ages. It does occur to Atrus that he might finally have a proxy to send to Riven, however, and mentions that he might be able to help with the stranger returning home, if they can help him again when the time comes. Over the next few months, the stranger was introduced to Rime, and Atrus would work to continue fortifying Riven, as well as observing the situation from Rime's crystal viewer. The situation was dire. Riven was still unstable, both in its society and in its physical foundation. After around 4 or 5 months, Atrus was ready to put his plan into place. He had finished writing another prison book, similar to the ones holding his sons. This one, however, was meant for Gen. He needed to sustain Riven as long as possible, so he asked the stranger to make their way to Riven in his stead, while Atrus continued writing. Armed with the prison book and Atrus's personal notes on the age, the stranger was given 2 objectives: to trap Gen and to free Catherine. Afterwards, find a means to signal Atrus so that he may arrive with a means of escape. At risk of capture, the stranger couldn't go to Riven with a linking book. The two also discussed the Star Fisher, a means of returning to Earth potentially, given that Atrus was able to deduce this was the destination of the passage, seeing as that's how his Myst book ended its journey on the stranger's home. Upon arrival on Riven, Gen still had the entry point guarded. Of course, no one had come through the link in roughly a year since Catherine. The station guard was about to doze off, expecting no one to arrive just like any other day, until the stranger arrived at the entry point, which had a small structure built by Gen around it. This was actually a cage with a pressure plate that when someone linked in, the plate would trigger, causing bars to raise and trap them. This happened to the stranger, and the guard monitoring the station was awoken from their half-slumber and motioned over to the stranger. Following the procedure given, the guard was told to immediately search for any linking books on the person if one was to arrive. He noticed the prison book, and despite some resistance, he is able to force it off the stranger's person. He starts to read through it a bit before collapsing to the ground. He had been hit by a poison dart from someone just outside of the stranger's view. 2 assailants appear, Moiety rebels who had been monitoring the station from a distance, and grab the prison book off the guard and drag the body away. Meanwhile, they pull a lever, dropping the cage and jamming the mechanism, essentially breaking operation of the cage bars. By the time the stranger leaves the cage, the two rebels are gone, with the stranger noticing the guard's body having been thrown off a nearby cliff. Now, a third objective had presented itself to the stranger: get the prison book back. The stranger started to explore the island that they had arrived on, one of the 5 islands that Riven had been broken up into. This one was dubbed simply as Temple Island by Gen, after the many places of worship that were constructed for him. In Rivenese, the natives called it Ayapo, meaning water pool, after the lake in the center which was used for power. The rebels started calling it Ayatwan, meaning pool of stars, named after the star fissure which was formed under the island. Via maglev tram, the stranger made their way to what Gen called Jungle Island, where most of the current natives of Riven lived, mostly in fear of Gen. Because virtually all of the Rivenese lived here, this island was simply dubbed Riven by the natives. Here, most of the Rivenese would hide from the stranger as they explored, looking for clues as to the whereabouts of the rebels. Eventually, the stranger makes their way to 2 more of the islands, Book Assembly Island and Survey Island. The villagers had no names for these, as they were only visited by Gen and some hand-picked guards and scribes. Here, the stranger found that this was where Gen did most of his experimenting and observing of both Riven and the art. Gen was nowhere to be found, but his journal was. The stranger read about how Catherine is being held on the final, smallest island, simply called Prison Island. This island was formerly where Riven's great tree was before it was cut for paper, to be used in books. Then it was turned into a private office for Gen, until finally being made into a prison. Gen was likely on the 233rd age, which the stranger read about in Gen's journal. Eventually, the stranger was able to find enough clues to locate the hideout of the rebels, a renovated cell in one of Gen's prisons. Here, the stranger could find a hidden linking book to Tay. The stranger linked and found themselves on a cove on the outside of a circular canyon, with a large tree stump and nest on the center island. Almost immediately, the stranger was hit by a tranquilizer dart and knocked out. The 2 rebels had hit them and dragged them on a boat to take them to the nest where most of those living on Tay resided. The stranger awoke in a room with a journal written by Catherine, which the stranger read to catch up on her actions since leaving Myst. Eventually, one of Catherine's friends, Nayla, arrived. Nayla arrived with the prison book that she convinced the guards to give her, as well as a linking book back to Riven. Finally, the stranger had the prison book back, and now needed to look for Gen. The 233rd age, even as small as it was, required its books to be powered by marble domes all across Riven. This was a result of Gen's ineptitude with the art. Cracking the code to unlock the domes meant having immense knowledge of Riven's geography and power sources. Undeterred, the stranger was able to use their collection and research of Riven to activate the books and make their way to Gen's hidden age. There, similar to Riven itself, Gen had rigged a cage that would trigger when someone arrived. Not long after the stranger was trapped in the cage, Gen returned to the single building on the age. He explained in his calm tone the nature of who he was and his relation to Atrus. He takes the prison book from the stranger and analyzes it. Similar to the books used to imprison Atrus' sons, this book gave a false view of what it appeared to be to an observer, though this time it appeared as if it was a linking book to Dunny. It had seemed that Gen was fooled for a moment, but realized this was too easy. The stranger was a bit frustrated until he heard Gen's request. In order to prove the authenticity of the book, he insisted the stranger link first. Suddenly, everything about how and why the prison books were designed made sense. It was a gamble, but the stranger took it, and linked using the prison book. The stranger observed a barren age, unlike the promised Dunny in the book, and anxiously awaited a few moments, until finally, Gen trusted the link himself and went through. By Atrus' design, the stranger was forced to link back through to the 233rd age, leaving Gen trapped in the prison book. The stranger was able to escape the trap in the 233rd age and began exploring Gen's private collection and chambers. They discovered a journal of his and began learning about the last few years of Gen's life. Following this, they discovered an arbitrary combination of sounds that Gen had by his bedside. Finally, there were 5 linking books, each leading to a different island of Riven. Here, the stranger knew what must be done. This was their chance to access the isolated last island, the prison island where Catherine was being held. Here, the stranger used the combination on Gen's bedside to open the cage and free the imprisoned Catherine. She was relieved to see an ally of Atrus's, and even more so to see that Gen was finally captured. She told the stranger to go plan a signal for Atrus, while she would inform the Rivenese of Gen's imprisonment and help them escape to Tay. Riven's time was extremely short now. It was beginning to collapse. The two separated, and the stranger needed to think of a way to change the age enough so Atrus would notice it. And also, the stranger was starting to think about how they could make their way home now with their missions completed. Might as well tackle both at the same time. The stranger headed back to the point of entry in Riven, which was near where the star fissure had been covered, mostly by iron and rock, with a small glass window. Here there was a telescope above it, used to observe the anomaly. Catherine had written the combination to the glass casing in her journal. After inputting the code, the glass was now accessible. The stranger proceeded to remove locks on the telescope, causing it to plummet into the window and crack it. The crack grew until the ground itself separated, revealing the star fissure once more. Riven had begun to fall apart, and Atrus absolutely saw this happening. The stranger saw the link point activate, and Atrus had arrived instantly, running towards the stranger. He asked about Catherine and the prison book, and before the stranger could answer, Catherine arrived and the two embraced. She happily showed the book with Gen trapped, and informed the two that Riven had been evacuated. The only ones left were the 3 of them. Atrus presented his Myst linking book to Catherine, which she uses, and Atrus prepares to follow, but not before Atrus says his goodbyes and thanks to the stranger, expressing hope they will meet again, leaving with the reminder that they know where to find him. He warps, leaving the Myst book to fall into the star fissure, and the stranger feels the ground below them crack as they let themselves fall into the fissure as well. The stranger and Myst book continue to fall in the starry expanse until they finally reach the other rift leading back to the cleft, the stranger's home, Earth. It wasn't long after the events on Riven that Atrus and Catherine realized that they were only being reminded of bad memories on Myst Island. Tiana and their children were gone, and they wanted an opportunity to start fresh. Atrus worked on building a home on the surface of Earth. Together they traveled to an area that Atrus had found from observing Dunny, which he dubbed Tomana. It was in the general area of the cleft, but more of a fertile canyon with water and the potential for vegetation. Here they built their new home in the valley. After moving their belongings, including all their books, to Tomana, Atrus once again continued to work on his writing. He wrote an age titled Averone, which was his first age since Narayan to include native inhabitants. Soon, Atrus started to reflect on his family, most of which had become lost. He needed a new goal, something to pay tribute to what he wanted the future of his family to witness. He decided to, in a sense, carry out his father's goal of rebuilding Dunny, but this time ethically and with proper guidance and structure. He wanted to start by grouping as many Dunny survivors as he could find, and thus this required expeditions to the ruins of Dunny. He employed the help of those in Averone to start excavating and unearthing the secrets of Dunny. The first step, of course, being to free the blocked passages that separated Kavir from the rest of Dunny. At this point, no portion of Dunny was toxic, but it was absolutely abandoned. The priority was looking for intact linking books with stable ages, places the Dunny could have fled to during the fall and stayed after the fact. Atrus's helpers from Averone were excited and enthusiastic, and Atrus is able to look through Gen's journal from the 233rd age to learn of Dunny legends that might help their research. Atrus and his team find some ages, and Atrus is able to gather some survivors and even followers. Eventually, they begin construction on the ruins of the fallen city. The population of the colony in Dunny grows to about 1,200 before a mysterious linking book is discovered inside a fortified room. A Dunny survivor, Tergan, encourages Atrus to leave the books be, but eventually he decides to investigate anyway, and the book is retrieved. Atrus discovered the book to be Terra Ni, an age where a majority of the Rhone fled during the fall of Garternay. Atrus knew not much beyond that from the books that held stories of the age. He, Catherine, and some followers traveled to the world and were greeted by an immensely beautiful world of Rhone descendants. While the grammar and accents were very different, the language barrier wasn't too great even after thousands of years. Atrus is guided by the friendly escort Idra. The travelers are quickly welcomed by aristocrats of the age, and Atrus immediately is given a tour as he starts telling them about his people and the age of Dunny. He is exceedingly impressed by the society, and it isn't long before he asks if Terra Ni can simply take in the Dunny survivors, which would be easier and safer than rebuilding the old city. The Rhone natives are quick to agree, and it seems like this would be a wonderful idea. However, Atrus starts to harbor doubt when he realizes that the values of the old writers and kings of the Rhone have lasted into present-day Terra Ni. He witnesses a class system. The Rhone aristocrats are harshly separated by a slave class that constructed all of the architectural and technological feats of the age. Between them is an intermediate class of overseers the aristocrats use to keep checks on the slaves. Those of Terra Ni believed those not of their race's blood who could not write books were inferior. An angered Atrus speaks out to the king of Terra Ni, describing the mixed blood of himself and the lack of either Dunne or Rhone blood in his wife, both of whom could write. Idra speaks of his compassion for the slaves, but only a few share his belief, and as a result he cannot speak out against the king. Atrus spends weeks thinking of the best course of action to take, when suddenly the decision gets taken out of his own hands. An invasive bacterium brought to Terra Ni from Dunny starts to spread amongst their populace. A bacterium that was unnoticeable to Dunny, as it was harmless to humans, and the native Dunny populace grew resistance to it. The countryside of Terra Ni quickly falls into chaos. The only people that were saved were those that the Dunny were able to quarantine and care for, which mostly included the slave population. Most of the population of Terra Ni were wiped out, including all of the upper-class Rhone. At this time, Atrus saw this opportunity to meet with Gat, who was the leader of the slaves, now freed after the death of their captors. Many intermediates who also survived attempted to claim power, but Gat and Atrus sent an army led by the militant Ymir to counter them. They succeeded, but Ymir quickly declared himself dictator of the new Terra Ni. Atrus and Gat planned a diplomatic way to take him down, but Ymir was quickly assassinated by his own subjugated servants. Atrus and Gat agreed it was best to leave Terra Ni, to seal it and let the past die, as the Dunny returned to Earth, and Atrus promised the slaves a home in either Dunny or other ages for them to be truly free. The whole Terra Ni debacle caused Atrus to reflect. Perhaps he should take letting the past die even further. His people's history were stained with misfortune and at times malice. He wanted his people to be defined by the future they chose to create, and not the ruins of a legacy left behind. And so, Atrus did what he did best. He wrote. He wanted to do as his distant ancestor Rhinareth had done, and created a new age for his people to call their own. One where they wouldn't be bound to their past, but could start fresh as new people salvaged from the old. Atrus would spend the next 7 years writing what would become Relishon, meaning the whole in Dunny. Over time, Atrus began looking towards past works for inspiration. One was the Age of Jananin, which along with its companion ages were used for training the fundamentals of age building to his sons. He traveled there to seek inspiration for the current age. He of course expected there to be no one else on this abandoned age. He was, unfortunately, wrong. Nearly 20 years earlier, Cirrus and Akanar had left Saavedro to die amidst a bonfire. Saavedro, however, was able to escape his immediate bindings and his death sentence. He was of course unable to chase the brothers, however, as they had left the Myst book burning in the fire. Saavedra was an intelligent scholar and was able to figure out the tests meant for the suns on Jnanin, Voltaic, Amateraea, and Adana. Eventually, he made his way back to Narayan. However, he could only get to the linking point, which was separated on a floating island, encased around an ice-like shield, through which he could only barely make out the other islands of his home, and was convinced it was desolate and his family was gone. He made his way back to Jnanin, and now with his family gone, combined with his exile, he was driven mad. On Jnanin there was a small ravine with a thick fog that Saavedra realized was hallucinogenic and became easy to lose one's mind. In his despair, Saavedra gave in to the fog and lost himself. Over time, he forgot who he even was. And for over a decade, Saavedra spent his days lying in the fog in Jnanin, in blissful ignorance of his former life. Until one day, in what he thought was another hallucination, he thought he could see a familiar silhouette in the distance. The figure was holding a book on a cliff at the edge of Jnanin. Saavedra thought it was death, come to finally take him, but to his surprise it was Atrus, who touched the book and linked away. Saavedra was afraid, but eventually made his way towards the cliff and the book. The fog had caused him to have a great fear of the book, but soon he overcame his concerns and opened it, and recognized a linking panel on the first page. Some of Saavedra's memories then came rushing back as he remembered who he was and why he was here. He kept the book and proceeded to write a journal in order to help him dispel the fog and recollect the fragments of his life that he was trying to piece together. His emotions soon manifested itself into anger, rage towards the two sons of death that had trapped him and killed his people and family. He wanted revenge on Atrus, who brought the angels of chaos and death to Narayan. He planned on using the book to go to Atrus's home and take his life. However, upon warping, he found himself alone in Atrus's study on Tumana. He started searching the cabinets and bookshelves. He found some journals of Atrus's, and memories kept pouring back into Saavedra, with his hatred growing ever stronger. He eventually found a Jnanin linking book and used it, knowing he now had a link only he knew was being used between the two ages. He returned a few times in secret to Tumana, and found great interest in Atrus's journal, detailing his progress with Relishan. He read how Atrus was bringing, quote, new life to Dunny with his project, and Saavedra made a deep misunderstanding. He believed Atrus possessed the ability to revive dead worlds with the art, and so he hatched a plan. He spent the next couple years manipulating the ages of Jnanin and planned to hold Atrus's precious Relishan as hostage until Atrus agreed to fix Narayan. All the while he observed Atrus's family and saw how despite the absence of the despicable sons, they were happy and in their new home, angering Saavedra, who had lost everything because of that family. A family that was, in fact, growing. A few months prior to the completion of Relishan, Catherine and Atrus had another child, a daughter named Yisha. It was a happy year for the family, and as such, with the final touches to Relishan being made, Atrus wanted to bring an old friend to celebrate what they had allowed to create. Atrus had gotten in touch with the stranger upon moving to Tumana, and the two had kept in touch through letters. Atrus and Catherine invited the stranger to come to Tumana, to introduce them to both Yisha and Relishan. The stranger happily accepted, and made their way back to the cleft, and then Tumana. Upon arriving, the stranger is quickly acquainted with the family, and is introduced to baby Yisha. Before long, Atrus eagerly brings the stranger into his study to show them Relishan, and to lead them on an expedition there. However, upon entering the study, Saavedra suddenly appears, linking to Tumana. He quickly grabs Relishan and throws a fire marble on the ground, sending Atrus's study ablaze. Atrus, in his surprise, only can call out, "No! Relishan!" as the book is taken away back to Jnanin, with Saavedra leaving the linking book, anticipating being followed. The book, however, is caught in the fire and only lasts a few moments before being unusable. In those few moments, though, The stranger, without thinking, rushes to the book and links to Jananin to give chase. The link is closed, and at that moment the stranger is trapped on Jananin. Saavedro, believing that he has lured Atrus to his age, goes ahead with his plan. The stranger makes their way through Jananin to the central tusk, where through a window he sees Saavedro linked to Narayan, using a linking book that proceeds to lock itself after being used by Saavedro. Upon entering the room, the stranger witnesses a recording left by Saavedro intended for Atrus. The recording tells Atrus to go through the trials his sons went through on the 3 ages of Jananin to find murals and hidden messages, and then meet him on Narayan. The stranger proceeds to go to the 3 ages and learn the fundamentals of each that Atrus had used to teach his children. On the energy-filled voltaic, the lesson of energy powers future motion was taught. On the brimming with life Edana, the lesson of nature encourages mutual dependence was taught. And finally, on the eccentric Amateria, the concept of dynamic forces spur change was taught. At each age, the stranger saw Saavedro's various tampering and manipulations, evidence of some puzzles being altered to make them more difficult from years past. Pieces of Saavedro's journal detailing his madness are spread throughout the ages, as well as some painted murals showing the trust and complete betrayal of Cirrus and Akinar towards the Narayan people. After visiting all 3 ages and returning to Jananin, the linking book to Narayan is now accessible. Upon arriving, the stranger finds themselves in the isolated island, surrounded by an ice shield. They quickly find a linking book that allows one to return to Jananin. Using the lessons taught in each of the ages, the stranger solved the first puzzle and lowered the ice shield. However, this only opened up the way to the balcony, where an outer ice shield still stood. This first puzzle was long solved by Saavedro, but the outer shield eluded him. With access to the balcony, the stranger climbed to the roof of the structure, where there was Saavedro's Tomana book as well, but the stranger needed Relation before they could go. Not long before approaching the roof, Saavedro revealed himself, and was mortified to discover that it was not Atrus that followed him. He was furious, and told the stranger that they were now trapped in the Jananin ages with him. If the stranger ever went back to Tomana, Saavedro would follow and attack Atrus's family. There must be something missing. The stranger went back downstairs to solve the mystery of the outer shield. They soon found that the device used to operate the outer shield required a solution that involved 4 lessons, a combination of the first 3 learned, as well as a final one which neither the stranger nor Saavedro, it seemed, could recall. But upon looking through one of Atrus's journals that the stranger had on hand, the final lesson was discovered. Balanced systems stimulate civilizations. From here, power was restored to release the outer shield, which when dropped, the distant islands of Narayan were brought into view. To Saavedro's shock and disbelief, his people appeared to be still alive in stable portions of the age. Maybe even his family was among them. There was a catch though. The power could only be dropped to one shield at a time, and mechanisms supplying power to both shields were located inside both domes. This meant that Saavedro would need to trust the stranger to drop the outer barrier so he could leave and go to the rest of Narayan. The stranger couldn't trust Saavedro given his state, but through some rather harsh diplomacy worked out an exchange. If Saavedro gave them Relation, they would drop the outer barrier. Upon performing the switch, Saavedro could finally leave the island and return to the Narayan people. With Relation in hand, the stranger returned to Tomana and returned the book to a relieved Catherine and Atrus, who were just finishing putting out the flames within Atrus's study. For now, Atrus's enemies remained trapped, but none were truly gone, and as the years went on, he would find that the past would continue to catch up to him. While he felt Gen was lost mentally, and couldn't be redeemed in his prison, Atrus always felt remorse for what happened to his sons. Maybe if he had raised them better, or grew them up in a better environment, or even focused on actually teaching them the art, he wouldn't have had to do what he did. And he and Catherine didn't want to make the same mistakes with their daughter Yisha. They decided to raise her in Tumana, overseeing her trips to other ages, and being willing to teach her both the Dunny language and the art. Meanwhile, Atrus couldn't stop thinking about his sons, and decided to use the viewer on Rhyme to see if they were at least still alive in their prisons, Spire and Haven. The brothers were indeed making the most of their respective ages. Upon his initial arrival, Cyrus built a bonfire on the tip of Spire before proceeding, where he looked for the Myst linking book his father must have used. He eventually realized that this age was not the place of wealth he believed, and that it was a prison age. His father must have let the book fall into the abyss with the sea of clouds. Cyrus begins to explore the rocky terrain, discovering crystalline caverns with minerals of magnificent properties that have incredible scientific potential. A few months into the imprisonment, the stranger arrives on Myst, and Cyrus tries to convince them to be released, which we saw how that turned out. Over the next few years, Cyrus writes a journal and dedicates himself to learning about the crystals and their electromagnetic potential. He's able to construct a means of descension down the grim cliffsides that could potentially allow him to traverse the area below the cloud sea of Spire. Upon doing so, however, he saw that the mountains only continued into a large plasma-like ball of energy below. The Myst book was lost, and for the first time since his arrival, Cyrus truly felt trapped. Over the years, Cyrus continues to advance the technology of Spire, creating a hovercraft of sorts to explore some nearby islands. He wanted to be sure the age was uninhabited, as Atrus had previously accidentally written a couple natives into intentionally barren ages prior. With no such luck, though, Cyrus began to take to sculpting as well, creating vignettes of his memories, while continuing the construction of more and more intricate devices and power sources within Spire. On Haven, Akinar was met with a much more abundant age. There were several species of wild beasts on a mostly jungle-filled island. There was also an abandoned shipwreck to make linkers believe that they had made it to a wealthy, or at least inhabited age. Similar to Cyrus, he started to look for an accessible Myst book, but he realized this was a prison age, when he couldn't find a book, and it was further confirmed with the actions involving the stranger. Here, Akinar made no major attempt to locate a missing Myst linking book. Atrus could have easily dropped it into a bonfire. In actuality, he swam into the middle of the swamp and used it while letting it sink, thus destroying it. Akinar spent the years fashioning small bases both in the jungle and on the shipwreck. According to his journal, he grew to favor hunting the small beasts, and spent most of his time studying their behaviors. In fact, he was even able to befriend the more intelligent Mangri species, something that would allow him to retain his sanity through the 20 years of exile. Meanwhile, Yisha is progressing well in her training, and she is growing into a fine writer, and more importantly, a fine person. Catherine and Atrus grew more remorseful and began looking at routes to rehabilitate, or at the very least, observe the sons more actively. Atrus began by looking at them remotely more often via the crystal viewer in Rhyme, before beginning the thought of entering the ages himself. Upon some convincing from Catherine, Atrus started planning, and later began writing additions into the Spire and Haven descriptive books. He wrote linking chambers, made mostly of hard Nara stone, into the linking points of both Spire and Haven. These were built to allow someone to link into the prison ages with the rest of the age separated by a glass wall. Think of these as similar to a prison's visiting room. It allowed for people to talk from either side, and allowed certain objects to be delivered on either side of the glass. Both brothers noticed the construction of these chambers, and for the first time in 20 years, they had confirmation that their father was alive. And soon enough, they each had the opportunity to meet with him once again. At first, only Atrus goes through the portals and meets with his sons. On Spire, Cyrus wants to discuss his accomplishments and advancements made on the age. But Atrus only discusses the past actions of the son, who burned the books in his library. He tries to desperately convince both his father and later his mother that he has regrets, but his envy still shows. He believes the only reason Atrus went to such lengths for them to meet was to further flaunt his power of the art, something no matter how intelligent Cyrus is, he will never have. He becomes convinced that his only hope now will be to escape. There is a linking book on Spire now, only separated from Cirrus by a Nara and glass wall, which, through his knowledge of molecular vibration and frequencies that he has mastered on this age, he might just be able to break free. Meanwhile in Haven, Achenar wanted to relay his adventures to his father. While he was impressed by the resourcefulness and tenacity of his son, Atrus was worried he had turned his son into a savage. Unlike Cirrus, who was interested in the sciences, Atrus didn't have much to relate to with Achenar. Fortunately, Achenar did appear less hostile and greedy in basic conversation, and was more willing to simply talk with his family. The two's development took a turn when Atrus thought it was time that the two sons finally met Yisha. Both had expressed a certain amount of shock that they had a new sister. Yisha, now about 7 years old, was excited to meet her brothers. Cirrus, very frank and to the point, could see how his father was so affectionate towards her. She seemed very bright and observant. Over time, he grew a bit jealous of how it seemed his parents cared about her. This jealousy turned into anger once he learned that she was being taught the art by Atrus, something he had abandoned teaching his sons out of fear of their abuse of the power. In Haven, however, Achenar had grown less bitter in his exile, and instead grew a greater appreciation of life and relations with other species on Haven. He was excited about the prospect of having a sister, and would talk for hours with her about stories that they both had. Often he would try and bring gifts from Haven for her, things ranging from fruit to a necklace of bones that he had made. This was met by mixed reception from his parents, but Yisha was always grateful, and it was clear Achenar cared deeply for her. He honestly couldn't care less whether she was being taught the art or not. Eventually, Cirrus realized that he needed a specific sample of Nara to match the frequency needed to break the linking chamber. He was unable to chip away at the linking chamber to get a piece. However, he recalled that he and his father used to play chess with a set made of Nara, and asked his father if he could bring the set in order to play a few matches. Atrus was happy to oblige, and Cirrus planned to use a couple of the chess pieces for his frequency experiments. Meanwhile, Atrus and Catherine were at an impasse as to what to ultimately do with the brothers, mainly if they finally deserved to be set free. Ultimately, they decided to ask for guidance from the only other person they could trust with the fate of these two, and that was the stranger. Atrus asked for the stranger to come and meet the sons face to face, and to see how they've changed. Catherine, however, would leave Tamana to clear her mind for a few days on Tay. The stranger had been to Tamana a few times since the Saavedro incident, and had seen Yisha growing up, but hadn't seen the brothers in the 20 years since they had left them trapped in their prisons. Upon arriving, Atrus first offers to show the current state of Spire and Haven through a crystal viewer, since Atrus had a second one made on Tamana. However, a glitch causes the right crystals to burn out, prompting Atrus to head to Rime to fetch replacements. In the meantime, Yisha leads the stranger on a tour through Tamana, showing some recent developments, and Atrus asks the stranger to repair some power systems on Tamana. The stranger does so, but soon after is knocked out by a mysterious blast. The stranger falls unconscious until a few hours into nightfall. The stranger quickly begins a search for Yisha, but can't find her anywhere in Tamana. Atrus is able to leave a message to the stranger through the viewer, and tells them that he is trapped in an electromagnetic storm on Rime. He likely won't be able to link back for about a day. While unable to locate Yisha, the stranger finds an amulet that was being worn by her, which allows the wearer to view an object's specific memories, and by using it, they can catch a glimpse of Yisha running from an unknown individual. At this point, the stranger is able to link to both Spire and Haven and uncover the pasts of both Cirrus and Achenar. The linking chambers of both ages have been destroyed by an apparent explosion, and neither brother is anywhere to be found on either age. Through the usage of the amulet, the stranger can deduce that Cirrus was successful in destroying the linking chamber, using the frequency generated from his Nara samples. He was able to create a few portable, marble-sized Nara bombs. He would use these to both cause the explosion on Tamana, and then on Haven to free his brother. On Haven, the two had a brief altercation, with the stranger not being able to see any more than that using the amulet. After fully exploring the two prison ages, the stranger arrives back on Tamana to witness Akinar link to Serinya using a book in Yisha's room. Yisha had spoken fondly of Serinya and its people, how she enjoyed the spiritual nature of their culture, and their ability to view dreams in a physical form thanks to a particular plant that grows on the age. The amulet that the stranger now held was a gift from one of the Serinyans to Yisha. The stranger gives chase to Serinya, and finds evidence that the brothers have kidnapped Yisha. They see Akinar run off, and eventually run into Anya, a protector of Serinya, and friend to both Catherine and Yisha. She says that she hasn't seen Yisha, but takes the stranger's warning seriously, and goes to warn the other Serinya protectors that Yisha may be in danger. Anya suggests the stranger visit the memory chamber where the protector's entire past and memories are stored in memory globes. On the way, the stranger witnesses Cirrus harvesting empty memory globes. However, upon being spotted, explodes the harvester with a Nara bomb. The destruction of the harvester will set the Serinyans back a bit, but there is a spare harvester near an older memory chamber. It was abandoned after its plant started emitting toxins towards the end of its life cycle. After exploring the age further, the stranger learns that using materials on Serinya, Cirrus has created a device that could remove memories from a host and put them into the empty globes. It seems that the original plan was to remove Atrus's memories of the art to teach to the sons, but they'll apparently have to settle for what Yisha knows. The stranger is taken to the Hall of Spirits, where the protectors have entered a dreamlike state to ask Serenian ancestors and guardians for advice on the whereabouts of Yisha's location. The stranger then proceeds to run into Akinar, who is holding an object called the Life Stone, stolen from the memory chamber. He says he knows it looks bad, but he's stealing it to stop Cirrus, who he claims has gone mad and kidnapped Yisha. He tells the stranger to find Akinar's journal, which details Cirrus's plan. Upon finding it, the journal details that Cirrus is actually planning on swapping memories between himself and Yisha, thereby essentially switching minds, allowing him to pose as Yisha and learn the art. Back at the Hall of Spirits, the protectors reveal that the dream spirits didn't make sense to them and ask the stranger to go in themselves. Upon finding a spirit guide, the stranger goes on a journey to the spiritual world. Inside the dream world, they talk with their guide, who reveals a specific color combination, which at the moment doesn't seem to make sense. After leaving the dream world and the active memory chamber, the stranger heads to the second memory chamber, where behind the entrance he finds Cirrus, who tries to convince the stranger that Akinar has Yisha and will kill her if the stranger doesn't stop him. He said he only destroyed the harvester to prevent Akinar from destroying the memory chamber, as Akinar has gone insane. The stranger already has a hunch as to which of the brothers is telling the truth, but makes their way to the back entrance to the second memory chamber, currently locked. However, the unlock combination was the color code the stranger was given in their dream state, and after inputting the combination, they decide to pursue Cirrus. Inside the memory chamber, they find Cirrus in a steel coffin, comatose, and Yisha tied to a steel chair. At a control panel, there are two levers to pull. Yisha begs the stranger to pull the left, which will release the restraints. As they are about to do this, Akinar runs in with a crossbow and tells the stranger that Cirrus has already gone through with his plan, and that this is actually Cirrus in Yisha's body. Yisha calls Akinar crazy and says he's just trying to kill both of them. Akinar refuses and begs the stranger to pull the other lever, which will return memories to their point of origin. Yisha claims that this will kill her, but Akinar insists on doing it before the memory chamber loses power from him removing the life stone. The stranger ultimately trusts Akinar and pulls the right lever. Akinar thanks the stranger while Cirrus has given up his act in Yisha's body and claims that his performance was perfect, before falling unconscious. However, something is wrong. The memory chamber begins to tremble as the plant begins to die, and Cirrus nor Yisha have woken up with their memories intact. The stranger once again returns to the dream state, this time in the same memory chamber as Yisha and Cirrus, allowing the stranger to visibly see both of their mental states. Meanwhile, Akinar tries to return the life stone to stall the death of the plant. The stranger's spirit guide shows how Cirrus's mind is still leeching onto some of Yisha's memories. Unlike the stranger or Yisha, who have spirit guides, Cirrus's mind would die in dream alone. so he clings on to Yisha's mind to survive. However, if the stranger can sort out the memories of Yisha and Cirrus to their original selves, Cirrus's mind will have nothing to cling on to, allowing Cirrus to be stunned long enough for Yisha to freely make her way back to her body. Upon successfully doing so, the stranger causes Cirrus's mind to drift off into dream and die. Upon waking, the stranger sees Yisha wake up in her chair, where they quickly pull the other lever, releasing her. Akinar heads into the room and reveals that he had to manually break the glass of the plant chamber to put the lifestone back, giving the stranger enough time to sort out memories. Akinar had ingested enough toxins for it to be fatal, as he is just barely able to make it back to Yisha to see her one last time. He expresses regret for his past actions, but no regrets for the sacrifice he has just made, before dying in her lap. Later, Atrus thanks the stranger for saving Yisha. He expresses both happiness for his daughter, along with sadness and regret for the deaths of his sons. Both he and Catherine vow to devote themselves to Yisha and provide her with the best possible life she could have. It's widely known that Dunny had exceptionally longer lifespans than other races in the series, including humans and the Rivenese. It was not known how much this life expectancy would be reduced if Dunny blood would be diluted, from a mixed parentage, for example. As it turns out, it didn't appear to be reduced much. Atrus lived far longer than Catherine, who passed at an unknown time following the death of her sons. Similarly, both Atrus and Yisha outlived the stranger as well. Yisha had the appearance as if she was only in her late teens and early 20s when she was likely in her late 40s or 50s when the stranger had passed. Following the death of his wife and the stranger, Atrus left Tomana and decided to take residence in Relation, assisting with the building of a new Dunny society where he would spend the second half of his life. Meanwhile, Yisha desired to go off on her own and, in her own words, find her destiny. Following the death of her brothers, she dedicated herself to learning the art, something her father was very motivated to teach, not wanting his knowledge to go unpassed to future generations. Yisha's knowledge of the art had become vast by the time that she went on her journey. She first went to the Cleft and restored a bit of her great-grandmother's home, which was left unattended for decades. Similar to her grandfather Gen, Yisha decided to make a journey down to the city of Dunny, where she would study their history and gain deeper knowledge for the people and their abilities. However, in the underground isolation, she would eventually start to hallucinate. She would form companions with various plants and animals that she met underground. Eventually, while wandering Agura, she made her way into a library. It was here that she met a Dunny survivor by the name of Callum. He was fairly old and a member of the Guild of Riders before the fall. It's unclear as to whether Callum had returned from another age or was a resident of Relation. Once Yisha realized that he was not a hallucination, she let down her guard a bit. They quickly became friends, traveling through the Dunny ruins together. They often argued about clashing views. Callum was firmly aligned with Dunny traditions, while Yisha questioned a lot of the Dunny ways. All the while, she admitted that there was still much for her to learn, and Callum was happy to fill in the blanks. Yisha became adept in both old and new styles of teachings, and seemed to possess the most advanced style of the art. Over the course of their exploration, however, Yisha and Callum discovered something incredible that was hidden deep within the Dunny city. Something that went undiscovered, even to most of the Dunny populace. This hidden treasure was a large tablet sealed in a chamber in Dunny. In the chamber, stories and descriptions of the intended use of the tablet surfaced, primarily in how it is related to a previously unknown race called the Baro. These creatures appeared as large bipedal, insect-like beings. They apparently had the innate ability to link between ages at will, though at the same time they were bound to the tablet in question. Whoever controlled the tablet controlled the Baro. According to the scriptures, the Dunny had enslaved these creatures using the tablet ever since their arrival. Why, and for what ends, is currently unknown. Yisha did not reveal the reason, and it's likely that she didn't think it mattered. Yisha read tales of the prophesized grower given by the Watcher in millennia prior, and was convinced that her friend Callum was the grower. However, as they were resting after another day of exploration, a bandit came to loot the two and in the process, murdered Callum. Yisha, in her rage, tracked down the assailant and killed them in revenge. She begins researching the tablet and reads more about the Watcher's prophecies. She suddenly begins piecing together more details about these predictions. The greater prophecies surrounding the grower seemed to have quite a few similarities with her family. The rebuilder of pride was her grandfather Gen. The burdened one was her father Atrus. The writer of dreams was her mother Catherine. The sons of the burdened one was her brothers Cirrus and Achenar, and that just left the grower. Someone who could eventually possess supernatural abilities, such as time travel and linking without books. Could this be her? Eventually, through the powers of the tablet, she met the Barrow themselves, and learned more about their abilities and their plight. She spent over a century learning from the Barrow, attempting to replicate their powers and writing. While her raw accomplishments aren't as well known as Atrus's, Yisha likely became the greatest wielder of the art who ever lived. Meanwhile, the human world was settling after 2 world wars and a fear-inducing Cold War, and after the fact there was an overall greater time of peace and the world set its sights on learning more about itself. In the late 80s, 2 wealthy American archaeologists decided to look inward and do some studying around their own country. John Lofton and Elias Zandi eventually concentrated their efforts around what had now become the Southwest United States. In 1987, Lofton discovered some of the Dunny digging machines buried just under the surface. Zandi was positively ecstatic by this find and quickly dedicated himself towards excavating and exploring the tunnels. They later took their first major trip inwards and discovered the top of the Great Shaft, which supposedly gave them a much greater perspective as to what they were stumbling across. Over the next year or so, they took 2 more major trips within the caverns. On the second, they made it as far as the internal Dunny passages and caught a glimpse of the immense ruins of the Dunny city. After this discovery, Elias Zandi started to make some calls to other connections he trusted, as well as purchasing thousands of acres of land above the caverns. Doctor of History Richard Watson became involved in the project and began exploring with the pair of archaeologists. On their next 3-week-long expedition, the 3 were able to make it to Agura, the capital of the Dunny city of old. On this land, they discovered an immense number of artifacts, including journals written by a woman seemingly named Catherine. Most entries were dated fairly recently in comparison to the city as a whole, only a couple hundred years prior. Elias Zandi felt something fascinating resonating from the journals. Upon arriving back to the surface, Zandi forwarded the journals to some friends of his, Rand and Robin Miller of Cyan Incorporated. Zandi encouraged them to present the stories as fictional in order to find people who understood, quote, the call. Using these detailed journals, the brothers began work on what would become the games Myst and Riven. Another expedition was led a year later, but this time, tragedy struck. John Lofton unfortunately lost his life during the voyage. While the circumstances remain unclear, Watson, to a great extent, seems to blame himself for the incident. Watson and Zandi continued the work of Lofton, seeking to restore this immense society. While they were able to work together, they had conflicting views on how to go about the restoration. Watson wanted to undergo a conventional archaeological restoration of the city. However, Zandi believed that there were humans who were partly of Dunny heritage, which wasn't entirely false, and had the unique idea to repopulate the city with those who believed they were descended from Dunny. At this time, Yisha began observing the explorers, but still maintained her distance to see if they were a threat to the Barrow. In around 1992, Zandi's health was beginning to fail. He later would have to have open heart surgery, and the doctors heavily encouraged him to slow down and retire his explorations, but he refused. At this point in the mid-90s, other explorers started to arrive, saying they felt the call after playing the first Myst game. Elias believed that these were the descendants of Dunny, drawn to the old site. These people would become volunteers in the restoration, including Elias's son, Jeff. Jeff became critical of the views of his father. Jeff thought that populating the old Dunny city was simply a physical restoration, and this needed to be a, quote, spiritual restoration of the people. The father and son would have a falling out, and likely never spoke after. However, it wasn't long before Elias's passing. He wore himself out with his efforts, eventually leading to a fatal heart attack in 1996. His money was left to the newly founded Dunny Restoration Foundation, and left his land to Jeff. This organization was quickly refounded by Dr. Watson as the Dunny Restoration Council, or DRC for short. Jeff wasn't interested in the DRC, still claiming it did not align with his vision for Dunny. For the next 6 years, Richard Watson led the Dunny Restoration Council and efforts in revitalizing the Dunny city as well as its neighboring ages. Some members included Douglas Sharper, who was in charge of Teledon and kept detailed journals of the goings-on in Dunny and Teledon. Nick White and Sam Reynolds started working with Watson to translate and decipher the Dunny language. Ikuro Kodama becomes an inspector for ages. Over time, more machinery and tools are being brought into the city in preparation of opening various aspects of the city to the public. By the end of the year 2000, parts of the Dunny city and Teledon were deemed safe. The ages of Garisen and Annonay are explored, and a device called Key is discovered that can be used for communication and record keeping. Think of it as a sort of PDA, or pager device, that's placed on your hand. Visitors start to come to the city as more ages start to open. The main island of Agura is almost ready. Some cavern stabilization needed to be put in place as well as better oxygenation for humans to navigate. Meanwhile, Yisha comes into contact with Jeff Sandy, who shares the spiritual drive of what Dunny should be. Yisha was extremely skilled as a writer. Not only had she mastered the art, but she possessed unique abilities through her time with the Barrow. She could link without the need of a book. She could create separate instances of an age, personalized depending on the owner of a book. She could create linking books that traveled with the user after using them to link. She could also create journey patches, which allowed for various specific linking points on an age, and a more convenient way of carrying these linking points. Through her power, she accepted her status as the grower, and during the years prior, she attempted to free the Barrow by taking control of the sacred tablet. However, she fell to the corruption of the tablet and its allure. Apparently, the tablet sensed the corrupted desires and stopped responding to Yisha. The Barrow were once again tethered to the Dunny city. Yisha fell into a deep despair, believing she had failed in her one chance to free the Barrow. However, upon realizing that explorers had started making their way to Dunny, she thought maybe there was someone with a stronger sense of a spiritual connection towards Yavo, the Barrow, and the links themselves. So, she decided that as the grower, she would lead these new explorers on a journey to acquaint themselves with the spiritual aspect of linking books. New travelers started arriving to the Cleft, where they received guidance from both Zandy and Yisha, allowing them to access the Cleft, Dunny, and the ages of Teledon, Garisen, Kadish Tolesa, Edergira, and Ederkemo. One of Yisha's abilities was the skill in personalized ages. She could create an age where each linking book would link to a user's personal version of the age that they could alter and expand without changing anyone else's version of the age. It was also possible to link to the age while within the age, something always thought to be impossible. The age was dubbed Relto, and its base form took some inspirations from the original Myst Island. Zandy had already announced to the DRC that this surge of new visitors was going to happen, and that they couldn't stop him, dubbing the project Uru. Yisha wanted new explorers to go on this journey to understand the nature of linking and ages, the history and current developments of Dunny, the plight of the Barrow, and to find a way to help. By fully exploring accessible ages, collecting the journey cloths placed about, and then gaining access to artifacts called Barrow Pillars, each explorer could release a trapped Barrow into the Rudenna Passage, a small cavern above Dunny. Upon the completion of these tasks, Yisha would meet with an explorer back at the Cleft, and give them some further insight. She explains how powerful she is, how Relto was originally the first age she ever wrote, and was a gift for her parents. Before leaving, she proves her immense power by doing something her father couldn't, but wishes he was able to for his grandmother Tiana. She causes rain to fall on the Cleft. Watson and the DRC are thrown into a bit of stress by the incoming unauthorized visitors, but they attempt to accommodate. They also discover the Relto books and reach out to Zandy for copies that can be given to the DRC. Also around this time, there are rumors that a legitimate Dunny survivor is starting to lurk about the city. Various rumors are starting to cause discouragement in the DRC's actions. The whole established order appears to be in a bit of turmoil, mostly out of speculation that Zandy and Yisha are right about the true way to rebuild Dunny. Phil Henderson was a DRC restoration engineer who went missing at some point in 2003, accidentally finding his way behind a borrowed door, and later making contact with the enigmatic creatures. This, in a sense, altered his mind. It was open far more than any of Yisha's explorers. He would seek out a Relto book, which was discouraged by the DRC at the time. He took the Uru journey and later convinced his friend Douglas Sharper to do the same, and he was also given a Relto book. Phil spoke in riddles, but gained a following as a believer in the messages of Yisha and Zandy. After an attempt to climb the Dunny Guildhall, he was captured by the DRC for his own mental stability. As a friend, and at this point believer, Sharper decides to start his own war on the DRC. Sharper was also deemed as too agitated amongst the DRC, and members such as Ikuro Kodama succeeded in taking numerous restoration projects away from him. Out of fear for his friend's safety, when Phil was eventually released by the DRC, Sharper stole Phil's Relto book. He believed Phil would not do anything too drastic without the book in his possession. This assertion was false, however, as Phil once again attempted to climb the guild hall. However, this time, the DRC could not stop him before a wall on the hall collapsed, causing Phil to fall and have debris fall on the man, killing him. Sharper would blame himself, saying Phil could have saved himself if he had his Relto book with him. Watson would fall into a period of mourning, and Sharper left for a couple weeks. On his return, Dunny is a mess. Most have left after Henderson's death, and Watson is wandering the tunnels without purpose. Laxman and Kodama take over efforts slowly as the city is closed from public access. Sharper decides to keep quiet and observe for a bit. No one has the energy to kick him out. Watson starts seriously considering if Jeff Zandy was right all along, and considers that the restoration should go in a different direction. He continues to find a way to have the restoration continue, while at the same time everyone's staying safe. However, he does come to the ultimate conclusion eventually, that Atrus was right. Dunny can't be restored. Atrus made the correct choice in starting from scratch with Relishun, and that's all that could be done. Watson eventually wanders to the Great Shaft and makes his choice to quit the DRC and travels back to the surface. Upon doing so, he also undergoes Yisha's journey of Uru. Over the next 2 months, funding for the DRC comes to a halt. The city becomes more and more abandoned once again. Kodama and Laxman leave their projects, and Sharper is the last to leave the city. Yisha, however, hasn't stopped her efforts. She calls upon the explorers that passed her journey to explore more of Dunny now that it has been abandoned, where explorers learn of the DRC's downfall and unfortunate circumstances that led to its shutting down. Areas such as the Bevan and Kirel neighborhoods were visited, as well as the Great Zero. Later, the final batch of explorers is led on one more journey by Yisha. In the Watcher's Sanctuary, a location frequented by Sharper, also known as the Great Tree Pub, is a legendary puzzle created by the old guildmaster Kaddish. It is known as the Path of the Shell. It is said to limit access to the eponymous Great Tree to those who could properly interpret the prophecies of the Watcher. Only Kaddish could ever solve the maze, as it was always meant to deceive others into thinking that Kaddish was the powerful grower mentioned by the Watcher. In order to solve the maze, explorers can go to Annonay, meant to showcase Kaddish's abilities of time travel, which was said to be an ability of the grower. The age contained 3 stages of itself, in the past, present, and future. However, upon careful exploration, it's revealed that all stages are just an illusion. The other age to visit was Erkana, which showed an industrial age that contained apparent contradictions, such as luminescent algae and cavernous lakes, but were actually clever scientific tricks created within reason by Kaddish. All of these are clues which explorers use to solve the path of the shell. Upon doing so, they find that it has been looted, and in place is a single linking book to Myst. Upon arriving in Myst Library, they must solve one more puzzle to receive a book to Kavir, where they meet Yisha. Here she reveals that she, not Kaddish, is the grower, and states that his body no longer lies in his vault. This implies that she traveled through time to save Kaddish, who was presumed dead after locking himself in the vault, thus proving she is the grower with extraordinary abilities, such as time travel. It's unclear why Yisha doesn't use her time-traveling abilities more often, but it's likely that her abilities are not omnipotent traversal through time. It is more likely that, as the grower, she has the ability to create a linking book that allows her to link to an age at a specific time in its history, and create an alternate timeline, or age, from her actions. At this point in time, Yisha bids the explorers farewell, and thanks them for their assistance in doing what they could to help the Barrow, and set Dunny on its proper path. During this period of time, only Yisha wandered the caverns of Dunny, wondering what to do next. However, she soon realized that she might not be alone, as the freedom granted from the DRC's exit allowed for a certain Dunny survivor to be less careful in how they walked the caverns. It was about mid-2005, and Yisha needed a solution to the problem of the Barrow's continuous imprisonment by the tablet. Thanks to the explorers of Uru, nearly all of the Barrow were now in Dunny. But so long as the indestructible tablet existed, the Barrow would still be at the whim of the user. Yisha started to consider that maybe the blood of the Dunny shouldn't be in contact with the tablet at all, and decided to seek out a human to be able to bear the burden of the tablet. Jeff Zandy was mysteriously unavailable, and so she decided to call for the only other human who undertook her journey and knew enough about the Dunny civilization. Dr. Richard Watson was summoned to Kavir to meet up with Yisha and show him the tablet that was in control of the Barrow. It was currently placed under a lock in a keep written by Yisha that could only be unlocked by extracting symbols from slates of various ages. These slates on 4 different ages seemed to be extensions of the tablet and could be used to give simple commands to the Barrow and utilize their unique abilities. The 4 ages in question being Tagira, Todelmer, Lakian, and Noloben, which is later revealed to be the native homeworld of the Barrow. However, before gaining access to the Nexus where these ages' linking books are held, Watson passes through the Cleft, where he meets a mysterious man named Escher. Escher reveals himself to be the Dunny survivor he has heard rumors of, and has been lurking through the caverns for the past few years. Over the course of his travels, Watson receives some slight aid from Escher, who tells of his lack of trust in Yisha due to losing herself to the tablet's corruption once before. Escher also blames her great-grandmother Tiana for Dunny's downfall. Watson uncovers some journal entries of Yisha's that seem to confirm Escher's suspicion that Yisha cannot be trusted with the tablet, as even she doesn't trust herself with it after her own experiences. Escher instead encourages Watson to eventually give him the tablet, who will use it responsibly. However, Watson uncovers evidence on Noloben of Escher's true persona. On Noloben, the Barrow's homeworld, Watson learns that this is where Escher fled in order to escape the fall of Dunny. Escher saw the Barrow as animals who perverted the art, a Dunny craft. He tortured the species in order to understand their abilities, and eventually takes a patch of skin from one of the Barrow in order to give himself the ability of linking without the need of a book. Through the torture, he likely learned about the tablet as well. He believed himself to be the grower, and thus sought to restore Dunny using the power of the tablet and the borrow. Using all the slates and releasing all the locks on the tablet, Watson received the mystical artifact. He is left with two choices, giving it to Yisha, or heading to Myst Island where Escher is waiting to receive the tablet. Watson, though, does not fall under the corruption of the tablet, and instead chooses a third option. In order to issue a command to a borrow, Watson would scry a specific symbol on a slate and place it on the ground in front of him. Similarly now, Watson places the tablet on the ground in front of him, issuing a command for the borrow to pick it up. The tablet now belonged to the borrow, and only they could decide their destiny from here on. Yisha appears both ecstatic and relieved by this, as the borrow instantly used their power to link a couple of their own, as well as Watson and Yisha, to Relishan, where they are greeted by an elderly Atrus. Atrus and Yisha embrace, as the borrow brings a restrained Escher, who is led to be imprisoned for his heinous crimes against the borrow. The borrow, for the first time in millennia, were truly free. Over the next couple years, the borrow had to decide how they would cope with their abuse and go about their future. Most wanted to move on, leaving the past behind. However, there was a faction, the Borrow Nekesal, led by a tortured subject of Escher's, who desired vengeance against the Dunny. This leader of the Nekesal ended up being the borrow whose skin patch was stolen by Escher. The peaceful faction of the borrow were dubbed by Yisha as the Borrow Shorat. At the same time, the DRC received a new benefactor in Kate Alexander, who desired to move ahead with the restoration in a more efficient manner, but also doing right by the spiritual nature of Dunny, and so invited Douglas Sharper back into the efforts in order to help with this aspect. Upon his arrival, Sharper is asked to deal with a creature on an age known as Negalan that has been viciously attacking wildlife. Sharper cannot find the beast, but sees evidence of a slaughter with vicious claw marks, but no tracks. He leads a second expedition to Negalan with fellow DRC member Nick White to further investigate. However, when on the Age, they receive a message that another member, Willow Engberg, is trapped in a cave-in on Dunny. At the same time, though, Sharper believes he sees a native bird-like creature, known as an Irwin, being carried away by something in the distance. He tells Nick to head back to help Willow while he investigates the creature. The creature lures Sharper into a field, who reveals itself to be a borrow, and Sharper realizes that he has walked into an ambush, where a number of other borrow rush into Sharper, believing him to be Dunny. Sharper is rescued by a second group of borrow, appearing just in the nick of time. Sharper flees back to Dunny to relay evidence of the Civil War to the rest of Dunny. It is later learned that Willow had been killed in the cave-in by a borrow. This enrages Sharper, who heads to Noloben, swearing to kill one of the hostile borrow in revenge. He returns claiming that he has done so, and leaves to aid the Borrow Shorats in their efforts in the Civil War. The DRC eventually disbanded following the Civil War, and after a few months of fighting, Sharper returns to the surface of Earth, where his whereabouts are currently unknown. Meanwhile, the Civil War continues to rage through ages, with the heaviest casualties being in Kavir and Relishan, the most heavily populated areas related to Dunny. Eventually, Yisha decides that this must stop, and takes responsibility on herself to do so. She travels to Kavir and claims that she will lure the Borrow Nekesal leader, and thus the war, away from the Ages. She claims she will be able to do so as she, quote, has something that belongs to him. While Yisha's whereabouts are now a mystery, she appears to have made good on her vow, as the Nekesal have left both Earth and Relishan, with peace coming to the Ages for the time being. And thus we have reached present day. A bit of a cliffhanger in some areas, but not without some closure with others. It is unclear if Dunny will ever see a full restoration, but for now, humans, Dunny, and Borrow are for the most part at peace, even if Yisha's whereabouts are currently unknown. There has not been a canonical entry in the series since Myst V, and the Myst Online forums have been mostly inactive, in terms of Word of God information at least, in over a decade. Nevertheless, Cyan has recently come back with a resurgence, their recent adventure game Abduction, as well as soon-to-come Firmament. Not to mention, the entire series has been recently re-released on Steam for the series' anniversary, so please feel free to check out this incredible series firsthand. The saga of Myst and the Dunny was indeed one of an entire civilization's rise and fall, and the lasting impact of its legacy. Saying that the lore of this series stretches far and wide would be a vast understatement. And even with the length of this miniseries, certain aspects did need to be summarized or cut for the sake of brevity. Nevertheless, the struggle of the Dunny people, Atrus's family, and the Barrow are something that millions have been able to experience personally through adventures created by talented developers looking to do what they do best, create immersive worlds. Hopefully this series has done what I set out to do, by taking a step back and observing the full scale of this experience as a whole. There was so much effort put into the saga and lore of these characters, these stories, and these ages, that it seemed a crime that it was so unknown to most. This was a universe that deserved a look that did more than just scratch the surface of the saga. First-hand experiences of all these adventures are heavily encouraged, because even though this world is fictional, it is more than easy to transport yourself to this timeless, wondrous universe of beauty, tragedy, and exuberance. I hope to see you on the shores of Myst Island, and as always, the ending has truly not been written. As a bonus aside to this journey, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at a long-standing tradition in the Myst series, the quote, bad endings. Every entry in the Myst main series from Myst 1 through 5 features bad endings that result from a non-canon choice made by the Stranger, or in the case of Myst 5, Dr. Watson. In the context of this mini-series, let's consider these to be the start of alternate timelines, continuities that are not canon but give some fun what-if scenarios. Most of these endings are a result of a wrong choice made near the end of their entries in the franchise, though there are exceptions. They also most of the time simply result in a game over or instant death of the player, but again there are some exceptions, and sometimes the credits do roll, lending to the credence that these are the beginning of an alternate non-canon timeline. In total, there are 24 alternative endings in the Myst series. Seeing as how we have a bit of time left in this episode, let's take a brief look at some of the other ways the Stranger could go about their journey. Beginning with the original Myst, the 3 alternate endings all have to do with the final choice made in the game, which occurs at the game's finale. With 1 page left to return to either the Spire and Haven linking books, the 2 brothers inform the Stranger of the final page's location in the fireplace, along with the mysterious green book that is actually the linking book to Atrus and Kavir. The first bad ending results in going into the fireplace and doing as Cirrus says, grabbing the red page and adding it to the Spire linking book. The Stranger then uses it and thus frees Cirrus. Cirrus is ecstatic about being freed before mocking the Stranger on their foolishness. The Stranger and Cirrus have swapped places, as looking through the panel the Stranger witnesses Cirrus continue his mocking as he begins to tear out pages of the red linking book. Static once again appears to fill the panel, as the last thing the Stranger hears is an indication that Cirrus plans on also destroying Akenar's book, now that he is free. The game ends with the Stranger trapped on Spire. The second ending is very similar, but instead involves bringing the blue page to free Akenar from Haven. The ending events happen in a similar manner. Unlike Cirrus's gawky boasting, though, Akenar appears more giddish and vibrant as he tears away the pages of the Haven linking book now that they've swapped places with the Stranger. He then presumably does the same to the Spire linking book next. This time, the Stranger ends their journey, trapped on Haven. Finally, the last timeline involves the Kavir linking book. If they do not heed Atrus's warning, and the Stranger immediately uses the linking book to go to Dunny without the missing page to Atrus's Myst book, they find themselves trapped with Atrus. An angered Atrus calls the Stranger a fool and scolds them. The Stranger and Atrus remain in Dunny, trapped forever, with the fates of Riven and the Sons left uncertain. The events surrounding Riven's alternate timelines are a bit of an outlier. There are quite a few, but they differ in the fact that they can occur throughout the adventure, rather than just in a couple decisions at the very end. For simplicity's sake, we'll be covering these endings in order of the earliest they can be obtained. The first ending occurs when the panel above the star fissure is opened, and the telescope is set to crash into the glass above the star fissure before the stranger reclaims the prison book or even goes to Tay. At this point in time, Atrus has not even considered the stranger being near done with their tasks, and does not even travel to Riven, leaving the crevice to collapse with the stranger alone falling through the passage, presumably back to Earth, with Riven's fate unknown. A curious trait is that while this ending was intentionally put in, it's potentially the hardest to achieve, as the only means of accessing the password to open the observation panel is in Catherine's journal, which is obtained at the same time as getting the prison book back. Since this code resets every playthrough, upon starting a new game the only two ways to get this ending are to either brute force the password, or to go to Tay, write down the password, and load a save from earlier in the game. The next timeline occurs by doing similar actions with the telescope, but this time after getting the prison book back, but before capturing Gen or freeing Catherine. Atrus will arrive this time and approach the stranger. The stranger shows the prison book, but Atrus is confused when he sees it empty. Gen then reveals himself and shoots Atrus, before taking his Myst linking book and thanking the stranger. The guard then shoots the stranger as well, killing them. The next few endings involve the prison book. After retrieving it, the stranger can use it any time, even before being in the presence of Gen. If the stranger enters the prison age while on Tay, including as soon as they retrieved it, they are trapped and the rebels on Tay find them in the book. They are confused but don't seem to take any chances with the mysterious book and the untrustworthy stranger. Given the glow around the rebels, it's possible that they are preparing to burn the book, but its and the stranger's fates are left unknown after the book is shut. If the stranger uses the book anywhere else, for example, Riven or Age 233 before meeting Gen, the book will open revealing Gen forcing his guard to enter the book. It's likely the guard found it wherever the stranger used it and brought it to Gen. This forces the stranger out of the prison age, and the stranger finds themselves in the cage on Age 233 with Gen. Before either says anything, Gen shoots the stranger, and as they die, Gen expresses his confusion at the situation, and his disappointment that he wasn't able to kill Atrus. If the stranger gets as far as Age 233 and meets Gen, the Mad Rider will eventually offer the stranger to go first into the prison book to prove the authenticity of said book. The stranger can refuse, and Gen leaves, giving the stranger a chance to think about the offer. If the stranger calls upon Gen 2 more times and continues to refuse the offer, Gen loses the trust of the stranger and shoots them, killing them in the 233rd age. After Gen is trapped, the prison book remains accessible to be used. If the stranger uses it at any time after trapping Gen, they once again swap places. Gen is free, and the stranger is trapped, leaving Gen to look into the book and question why the stranger made such a move, before closing the book for good, with no chance of escape. The most fleshed out alternate timeline is if the stranger signals Atrus by opening the star fissure after capturing Gen, but before freeing Catherine. Atrus arrives and asks to see the prison book. He is confused as to why he was signaled before his wife was free. He expresses grief that his wife is trapped on a collapsing age as he returns to Myst. This is the only other ending to receive a closing narration from Atrus, as he laments over the sacrifice of his wife and the uncertainty of Riven and its people. The final ending to Riven is a bit of a secret one. If the stranger heads back to Tay after capturing Gen and uses the prison book there, they will swap places. The stranger then sees Gen readying his rifle, presumably with the intention of slaughtering the rebels on their age, which had eluded Gen until now. Gen thanks the stranger before closing the prison book. All of the alternate endings to Myst III revolve around the final choice made in the diplomacy in both getting Relishan back and also allowing Saavedro his freedom. The first of which occurs as soon as the stranger meets Saavedro face to face on Narayan. If the stranger does not heed Saavedro's warning and immediately goes back to Tamana, where Catherine and Atrus are, Saavedro keeps his promise, and before the two can ask about Relishan, they witness Saavedro also travel to Tamana as he knocks out the stranger with a stone hammer. And the last thing the stranger hears being the screams of Catherine and Atrus as he sees Saavedro moving to attack them. After Saavedro makes the offer for the exchange of Relishan in return of opening the outer barrier, he will become frustrated if the stranger still remains in the presence of Saavedro without doing what was asked. If the stranger stays around Saavedro for too long, the exiled becomes frustrated and attacks the stranger. There are two versions of this, one where the stranger simply stays by Saavedro after his demands are made, where Saavedro eventually tosses Relishan over the side of the island and attacks the stranger. The second variation involves the stranger leaving partway through annoying Saavedro to seemingly complete the task, and then returning to Saavedro to frustrate them further. This causes slightly different dialogue, as well as Saavedro instead choosing to attack the stranger with the Relishan book, as opposed to the hammer. If the stranger chooses to free Saavedro immediately before encouraging him to return Relishan, Saavedro will take advantage of the situation. With his exit clear, he decides not to hold up his part of the deal, as he still holds anger for Atrus' family. He decides to toss Relishan over the side of the island and proceeds to make his way onto the gondola back to Narayan. The stranger can choose to link with Tamana, where they relay the news to Atrus and Catherine, who end the game in mourning of the age, and depressed at the failure to recover the book. A similar ending can occur if power to the shield is taken down atop the balcony. This is largely the same, but with a different angle of the events that transpire with Saavedro's escape. If you trap Saavedro between the shields, which is how you convince him to give the Relishan book back, first he lies in between the shields depressed. If you raise the inner shield after doing so, Saavedro takes this opportunity to brandish his hammer and attack the stranger. A slightly different scene plays out, depending on if the stranger immediately raises the inner shield again, and what direction they look at immediately after doing so. The final ending of Myst III is likely the most similar to a canon ending in the entire series. After getting the Relishan book back from Saavedro, the stranger has the choice to leave Saavedro trapped between the shields, or set them free to return to Narayan. Setting him free is the canon ending, however the stranger can simply leave and return to Tamana, where a very similar ending takes place between the stranger, Atrus, and Catherine. The only difference is a slightly altered closing narration from Atrus, who details his sorrow towards his son's actions, and wonders if he was in the stranger's shoes, would he have left Saavedro stranded? Myst IV and V have the fewest alternate endings, at just 2 apiece. Both endings in Myst IV revolve around the levers the stranger must pull at the end of the adventure. When Yisha is restrained and asks to pull the left lever, and Akinar enters asking to pull the right. The right is the correct choice, but if the stranger pulls the left, Cirrus and Yisha's body is free and runs to the back of the room to drop a hanging stone slab used to travel into the dream slate. This presumably crushes Akinar and knocks out the stranger. The stranger awakens to find Cirrus with Akinar's crossbow, who says that this proves his performance must be good enough to fool his parents, as he kills the stranger with the crossbow. The other ending occurs if the stranger waits too long before picking either lever. Akinar will get frustrated and lean over to encourage the stranger, as Cirrus uses some sleight of hand to grab the crossbow and shoot Akinar. He then proceeds to kill the stranger to remove complications, and claims that more bodies will only make the kidnapping more believable. Finally, the alternate endings in Myst V revolve around the decisions made with the Barrow tablet at the end of the adventure. If Watson gives Yisha the tablet, it falls through her hands and the tablet is lost. This results in a depressed Yisha to warp away from Watson, gone with an uncertain fate. From here, if Dr. Watson chooses to go to Myst Island, Escher will arrive and scold Watson for giving Yisha the tablet before abandoning them on Myst without escape. Finally, the last ending involves going to Myst with the tablet and giving it to Escher. He will get excited over the fact that Watson trusted him, before telling the Doctor that now he will gain control of the Barrow and use them however he pleases. Escher rewards Dr. Watson with Myst Island as he once again leaves the Doctor, trapped without escape. Thank you all so much for watching what I believe is the definitive version of this series that I made last year. This was a long time coming, so if you're back from those videos, thanks for being patient, and if you're tuning in for the first time, I hope you enjoyed it. There's plenty more on the way from this channel, which I hope you look forward to. See you guys next time.